Trauma bay doors exploded open and every doctor in the room froze. Not because of the woman on the gurney unconscious, bleeding, barely breathing, because of the dog standing over her. A military Belgian Malinois, 70 pounds of muscle and training, had planted itself across the patient's chest and was showing teeth to every person who moved closer. 2 paramedics had already backed against the wall. A resident had dropped his clipboard. Dr. Harlan Briggs, chief of trauma, was shouting for animal control when the new nurse, the one nobody ever looked at, twice stepped through the crowd, crouched to the animal's eye level, and said 2 words so quietly that half the room didn't even hear them. The dog sat down immediately, and the room went completely silent. Before we go any further, if you're new here, please take a second right now and hit that subscribe button. Every week I bring you stories like this one, dramatic, emotional, and full of twists you will not see coming. Hit the like button if you're already hooked, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to know how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it, because this one doesn't slow down. The shift had started at 6 in the morning, same as every other Tuesday, and Nora Vasquez had arrived 12 minutes early, the way she always did, badge already clipped, hair already pulled back. Coffee she hadn't finished, left slap sitting on the break room counter, because there was never quite enough time. Hargrove Medical Center sat on the east side of Fort Crest, Colorado, a mid-sized city that had grown up around a military installation and never quite decided whether it was a military town or a civilian one. The hospital reflected that tension. Half its trauma cases came from the base. The other half came from the highway interchange 3 miles north, where the speed limit dropped and the guardrails were too short. Staff had learned to handle both, and most of them were good at their jobs. Nora was better than good. She just didn't make a point of it. She was 33 years old, mixed heritage. Her mother had been Puerto Rican. Her father had been a mechanic from Tucson, with the kind of face that people looked at and immediately categorized as helpful rather than in charge. She had learned over the years that this was both a disadvantage and occasionally useful. People talked around her. They assumed she was following rather than leading. They gave orders to her face and then forgot she was in the room. 9 weeks at Hargrove, and she had heard the word just in front of her job title more times than she could count. She's just a nurse. Can you get one of the nurses? Just a nurse. Doesn't need to be anyone important. Vasquez, you're not expected to understand the clinical picture here. That last one had come from Dr. Harlan Briggs on her 3rd day, when she had flagged a sepsis indicator in a post-op patient that his residents had missed. The patient had been moved to the ICU 6 hours later. Briggs had never acknowledged that she had been right. He had simply moved forward, the way men like him always did, filling the space around them, with enough noise and authority that accountability never quite caught up. Nora had written it down in the small notebook she kept in her locker, not out of bitterness, out of habit. She had learned a long time ago that documentation was the only form of memory that held up under pressure. The morning was busy but manageable. A construction worker with a fractured radius. Teenager with an asthma attack bad enough to require magnesium. A woman in her 70s who had fainted at the grocery store and arrived more embarrassed than frightened. Nora moved between them steadily, starting IVs on the first attempt, charting accurately, flagging the things that needed to be flagged. Dr. Briggs passed her twice in the hallway without making eye contact. His senior resident, Dr. Pamela Osi, did stop briefly to ask Nora to pull labs on a patient she had already pulled labs on 20 minutes ago. Nora told her the results were already in the chart. Osi blinked, thanked her in a clipped way that suggested she hadn't expected competence, and walked off. Nora went back to her station. It was the kind of morning that felt like it would stay manageable, and she had learned not to trust those. 10:47, the radio on the charge nurse's desk crackled. Trauma incoming. 23-year-old female. Vehicle collision. High speed. Driver's side impact. Vitals deteriorating en route. ETA 4 minutes. And then after a brief pause from the paramedic on the other end, there's a dog. Military working dog. He won't leave the patient. We couldn't separate them. You need to have someone ready. The charge nurse, Darlene Foss, looked around the bay. Animal control? 40 minutes out, someone said. Then someone call the base vet. 4 minutes, Nora said quietly. We don't have time for any of that. Darlene looked at her. Do you have a better idea? Nora didn't answer right away. She was already pulling on a second pair of gloves, and moving toward the trauma bay doors, and, whatever she was thinking, she kept it behind her eyes. The rig pulled in at 10:51. The back doors opened and the dog came first, not lunging, not wild, but moving with a deliberateness that stopped the trauma team where they stood. He was a Belgian Malinois, maybe 70 pounds, wearing a tactical vest with unit markings and a red crosspatch on the left flank. His eyes moved across the trauma bay in a single, comprehensive sweep, and then he turned and positioned himself alongside the gurney as the paramedics rolled it through the doors. "Get that animal secured," Briggs said immediately. He had appeared from nowhere the way he always did during traumas, materializing at the center of things as if he had been there all along. "Who authorized?" "Nobody authorized it," the lead paramedic said, breathing hard. "He wouldn't leave her. We tried. The patient was young, the kind of young that made the whole room tighten up. Dark hair matted against the side of her face, a laceration above her left eye that had bled significantly. Her arm was splinted, her neck was collared, and the oxygen sat on her face at an angle that told Nora the paramedics had been fighting to keep it there. Her blood pressure was on the monitor, 84/52, and dropping. The dog stood at the side of the gurney, watching. Two of the residents moved toward the patient from the left, and the animal's posture changed a shift in weight, a low sound that wasn't quite a growl, but was close enough that both residents stopped moving. "Get security up here," Briggs said, "and somebody call Fort Crest Base. Tell them they have a working dog loose in my trauma bay." "He's not loose," Nora said. She had moved without anyone noticing. She was crouched 3 feet from the dog, not reaching, not forcing, just present, at his level, looking directly at him. "Gez," Briggs said sharply. "Step back." She didn't. The dog's ears shifted, his weight redistributed. He was reading her the way trained dogs read people, not the words, but everything underneath the words. The body, the breath, the steadiness. Nora looked directly into the animal's eyes. She said 2 words, "Lodestar." "Rest." The dog sat. The trauma bay went completely quiet. Nora stood, pulled her gloves tight, and turned to face the team. "He'll hold. Let's work." For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Briggs was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, somewhere between fury and something else, something edged with unease. Then the resident to his left cleared his throat, and the room came back to life. The patient's name, according to the medic alert bracelet on her right wrist, was Adrienne Calloway, age 23. The bracelet also carried a military ID number, which meant she was either active duty or the dependent of someone who was. Nora called the labs, pushed fluids, and got the ultrasound cart moving while Briggs stood at the head of the bed delivering orders in the tone of a man who needed the room to know he was in charge. His orders were not wrong. They were also, Nora noticed, about 45 seconds behind where she already was. The fast exam showed what she had suspected. Free fluid in Morrison's pouch. A significant amount of it. "She's bleeding internally," Nora said. "I can see the scan," Briggs said. "Her pressure's 81 and falling. If we don't move her to the OR in the next... I'm aware of the pressure, Vasquez. She's going to code before she gets there if we don't." I said, "I'm aware." Briggs's voice came down hard and flat. He turned to the resident beside him. "Get me a second large bore on the right AC. Push another liter of saline wide open. Get surgery on the phone." Nora had already placed the second large bore IV. She was already hanging the second bag. She did it without commentary. Because there wasn't time for commentary, and because she had learned that in a trauma bay, the patient didn't care who got the credit. The dog had not moved. He sat where she had told him to sit, watching Adrienne with the focused, unblinking attention of an animal that had been trained for exactly this kind of chaos. The rest of the team had stopped looking at him, which meant the room had found its rhythm. That was when Nora noticed the bruising. Adrienne's left shoulder, exposed now where the paramedics had cut away her jacket, showed impact bruising that didn't match the driver's side collision story. Pattern was wrong. The concentration was wrong. This wasn't the kind of bruising that came from an airbag or a door panel. This was distribution, bruising the kind that came from a restraint failing under force. A very specific kind of force. Nora kept that thought to herself and kept working. Surgery arrived at 11:04, assessed Adrienne for 90 seconds, and immediately called for an OR. The gurney started moving. The dog stood and fell into position beside it without being directed, and Nora walked with them to the OR corridor, where the surgical team drew the line. The dog doesn't go past this point, the scrub nurse said. He won't need to, Nora told her. She crouched beside the Malinois again, and this time she put one hand, very gently, flat against his side. Could feel his heartbeat fast, but steady. She's going to be okay, she said, to the dog more than anyone else. Stay. He stayed. The doors closed. Nora stood in the corridor for a moment, alone with the sound of the ventilation system and her own thoughts, and then she went back to the trauma bay to write her notes. Dr. Briggs found her at the charting station 20 minutes later. She heard him, before she saw him, the particular sound of his shoes, which were expensive and hard-soled and clicked in a way that she had come to associate with incoming displeasure. Vasquez, Dr. Briggs. He pulled up a chair that he didn't sit in, just rested one hand on the back of it, which was a thing he did when he wanted to establish presence, without committing to a conversation. Command you used on that dog. It worked, she said, without looking up from the chart. Where did you learn it? Online, she said. The pause that followed was the kind that meant he didn't believe her but couldn't prove otherwise. I need you to understand something. In my trauma bay, during an active resuscitation, the attending physician directs the response, the nursing staff. You placed an IV before I ordered it. Placed it because she needed it. That is not your call to make. Nora looked up at him then, directly, calmly the way she had looked at the dog. Her pressure was 81 and dropping. Every minute without volume replacement increases her risk of... I know what it increases, Briggs said, and I know how to run my team. What I don't need is a nurse making independent clinical decisions in front of my residents. I wasn't making decisions, Nora said. I was doing my job. Your job, Briggs said carefully, is to follow the clinical lead, not to anticipate it, not to run ahead of it. He straightened up. I'll be noting this in your file. We'll talk about it more formally next week. He walked away. Nora watched him go. Then she opened her notebook, found a clean line, and wrote down the time, the date, and a brief summary of what he had said, not out of bitterness, out of habit. Documentation was the only form of memory that held up under pressure. The afternoon arrived quietly, and for a few hours, Hargrove Medical Center ran the way it was supposed to. Nora picked up 2 more patients, a construction foreman with chest pain that turned out to be musculoskeletal, and a child with a dog bite that required irrigation, and 3 sutures. She worked both without incident, without accolades, without anyone noticing that she had caught the musculoskeletal presentation before the attending had ordered the troponins. She checked on the OR status twice. Adrian Calloway was still in surgery. The Malinois was still in the corridor. A security guard had tried to move him twice. Both times the dog had simply looked at him, with an expression that communicated, without ambiguity, that this was not going to happen. Security guard had eventually brought a bowl of water and left it on the floor nearby, which Nora thought was probably the most reasonable thing anyone had done all day. At 2:15, 3 men walked through the front entrance of Hargrove Medical Center. They were dressed in civilian clothing, dark jackets, plain shirts, nothing that announced them. But they moved the way people moved, when movement was something they had trained rather than learned, and Nora, who was standing at the nursing station with a direct sightline to the entrance, noticed it immediately. They approached the front desk, showed identification. The receptionist, who was 22 and relatively new, said something and pointed toward the OR corridor. The 3 men turned. The one in front, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been broken at least once and healed slightly, off-center, scanned the room in the same systematic way the Malinois had scanned the trauma bay. His eyes moved across every face in the space, checking and discarding, until they landed on Nora. He stopped. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second, and then looked back at the chart in front of her. Her hands were steady. She had made sure of that. The man walked toward her. Nurse Vasquez? She looked up again. Up close, he was older than she had estimated, early 50s, with the specific kind of weathered quality that came from time spent outdoors in difficult conditions, rather than from age alone. He had a scar running through his left eyebrow that someone had stitched neatly at some point, years ago. Yes, she said. I'm Sergeant Major Warren Delk, U.S. Army. I'm here about Adrian Calloway. He paused. And I'm here about you. Nora set the chart down. She did it carefully, deliberately, because her hands needed something to do that wasn't immediately visible as a reaction, and because she needed 2 seconds to arrange her face into the expression of a woman who had no idea what that sentence meant. I'm not sure what you mean, she said. Delk looked at her. He had the patience of someone who had spent a great deal of his professional life waiting for people to stop pretending. Think you do, he said. But we can get to that. Right now, I need to know about the patient's condition. She's in surgery, Nora said. Internal bleeding. The surgical team is managing it. Beyond that, I can't discuss her medical status with. Her father is Colonel Marcus Calloway, Fort Crest Installation Commander. I'm part of his protective detail. He's on his way. Delk pulled a card from his jacket pocket and set it on the counter between them. And there are some things about this situation that go beyond the car accident. The way he said car accident, with a very slight, very controlled emphasis on the word car, told her everything she needed to know about how accidental the accident had been. Nora looked at the card. She didn't pick it up. I'll let the charge nurse know you're here, she said. Someone will come and get you when there's news from the OR. Delk studied her for another moment. Then he nodded, picked up the card, and handed it to her again. Keep this one. The other men with me are going to be in the building for a while. If anything changes, anything at all, I'd appreciate a call directly. Nora took the card. Delk walked back toward his team. Nora stood at the nursing station and stared at the empty doorway for a moment. Then she reached into her pocket and found the folded paper she always kept there, not a habit anyone else knew about, not something she had explained to anyone at Hargrove, and she pressed it flat against the inside of her palm until her breathing steadied. She had spent 4 years and 9 months making sure no one in any hospital would ever look at her the way Delk had just looked at her. 4 years and 9 months, and it had taken approximately 45 minutes. 3:40, the surgery attending came out to report. Adrian Calloway had survived the procedure. The bleeding had originated from a lacerated spleen, compounded by secondary hepatic bruising. They had repaired what they could and removed what they couldn't. She was being moved to the surgical ICU. She would need time, but she was alive. Nora was not officially assigned to the surgical ICU. She went anyway, because she had a legitimate charting question about Adrian's pre-operative fluid management, which was true and also convenient. The SICU on the 3rd floor was quieter than the trauma bay, the specific pressurized quiet of rooms where people were being kept alive by machines and vigilance. Adrian was in Bay 4, still sedated, a ventilator, breathing for her in a slow, measured rhythm. The Malinois was in the room. He had apparently followed the gurney from the OR corridor to the elevator to the SICU, and no one had managed to stop him, and he was now lying on the floor beside Adrian's bed, with his head resting on his forepaws, watching her chest rise and fall. The SICU charge nurse was standing near the door, looking uncertain about approximately all of it. He'll stay calm, Nora said, as long as she's stable. You can guarantee that? No, Nora said honestly, but I can stay close. The charge nurse made a decision that was probably against several protocols, and Nora appreciated it. She sat with the chart near the room entrance and watched, and thought about the bruising she had seen on Adrian's shoulder, and about the way Delk's eyes had found her face across a crowded waiting room, and about the 2 words she had said in the trauma bay that she had not spoken aloud in 4 years and 9 months. At 4:20, Colonel Marcus Calloway arrived. He was in uniform Class A, full-service dress, every decoration placed precisely, and he was flanked by Delk and one of the other men from the entrance. He was a tall man, somewhere in his late 50s, with the kind of composure that had clearly been assembled deliberately over decades. His eyes were Adrian's eyes, dark, quick, and currently carrying something that wasn't quite fear, but was close enough to it that Nora recognized it from the other side. He stopped at the door of Bay 4, saw his daughter, and let out a breath that was very quiet and very controlled and held a great deal inside it. Then he looked at Nora. "You're the nurse who was in the trauma bay," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir. My man tells me you managed the dog." "The dog managed himself. I just gave him permission." Calloway studied her. He had the same quality. Delk had the patience, the waiting, the sense that he had heard a great deal of things people said in place of what they actually meant. "What command did you use?" Nora met his eyes, lodestar rest. "It's a tactical stand-down command." "I know what it is," Calloway said. "I'm asking where you learned it." The room was quiet. The ventilator breathed. The dog from inside Bay 4 lifted his head and looked at Calloway, then at Nora, then back at Adrian. Nora said, "I should finish my notes." She picked up the chart and walked back to the nursing station, and she did not look behind her. And she kept her steps, even in unhurried, because she had learned a long time ago that the way you left a room told people almost as much as anything you said in it. The evening shift started at 7. Nora was supposed to hand off at 6:50, but there was a new admission on Bay 2 that ran long, and by the time she finished the handoff report, it was 7:12, and the overnight nurse, Sandra Breck, was giving her the look that meant you can leave now. I've got it. Nora went to her locker, changed her shoes, pulled on her jacket. She was reaching for her bag when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Fort Crest area code, she answered. Mrs. Vasquez. Nurse Vasquez, a woman's voice. Measured, direct with the cadence of someone who had spent a long time in rooms where every word had consequence. My name is Iris Tran. I work for a federal investigative division out of Washington. I'm going to need about 15 minutes of your time before you leave the building tonight. Nora's hand tightened on the phone. Why? Because Adrian Calloway's crash wasn't random, Tran said, and because whoever targeted her knew details about the installation that they shouldn't have had access to. We've been pulling records from the last 6 weeks, looking for patterns, access points, irregularities. A pause. Your name came up. My name, Nora said carefully. Not the way you're thinking, Tran said. We flagged a personnel file that doesn't match. Specifically, a nursing credential with a 9-year gap in employment history that doesn't line up with any civilian record we can find. Another pause, shorter. We found what was underneath the gap, Nora. Or should I say, Ghost Hawk. The locker room was very quiet. Nora stood with the phone against her ear and looked at the middle distance and thought about the 4 years and 9 months she had spent building a life that was entirely ordinary. I'll meet you in 15 minutes, she said. She closed the locker. And somewhere above her on the 3rd floor, in Bay 4 of the surgical ICU, a man who had once watched his entire team come home alive because of a pilot he never met was sitting beside his daughter's bed and trying to understand why the nurse with the steady hands and the classified command code was working the day shift at Hargrove Medical Center in Fort Crest, Colorado. Nora walked out of the locker room and toward whatever was coming, the same way she had always done everything, quietly, completely, without anyone realizing how ready she had been all along. The woman waiting for Nora in the small family consultation room off the main corridor was not what she had suspected, which was probably intentional. Iris Tran was maybe 45, slight in the way that read as deliberate rather than accidental, with dark hair cut bluntly at her jaw and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead that she never once put on during the entire conversation. She was sitting when Nora entered, but she stood immediately, not deferentially, but the way someone stood when they had been trained to assess a room from a standing position. A leather portfolio sat closed on the table in front of her. She had not touched the coffee someone had brought her. Nurse Vasquez, she said. Thank you for coming. You didn't leave me a lot of options, Nora said. No, Tran agreed without apology. I didn't. Please, sit. Nora sat. She did it the way she did everything in rooms like this, back straight, hands visible, face calm. She had learned that stillness communicated more than posture in situations where someone was watching you closely and drawing conclusions. Tran was very definitely doing both. How long have you been working at Hargrove Medical Center? Tran asked. 9 weeks. And before that, Denton Regional in Denton, Texas. Before that, a travel nursing contract in Phoenix. Before that, 2 years at a clinic in Flagstaff. Tran didn't open the portfolio. She recited it from memory, which told Nora that she had been looking at this file for longer than one afternoon. And before Flagstaff, there's a gap. About 4.5 years. No employment record, no tax filings, no residential lease, no utility accounts. You existed in every official sense, but you weren't anywhere. She paused. That's a very particular kind of invisible. People go through hard periods, Nora said. They do, Tran said. But they don't usually surface on the other side with a civilian nursing license, a clean credit history, and employment references that check out from places no one can quite locate on a map. She tilted her head slightly, found the military record. It took some doing. The file was flagged for restricted access, which is itself informative, but we found it. She set both hands flat on the portfolio. Warrant Officer First Class Nora Vasquez. Special Operations Aviation Regiment 160th SOAR. Call sign Ghost Hawk. 12 classified missions in a 30-month deployment window, decorated twice. And then separation from service under circumstances that are, to be charitable, unusual for someone with her operational record. The ventilation in the room was too loud. Nora had noticed it when she walked in, and it hadn't gotten better. "I'm a nurse," she said. "You're that too," Tran said. "But you're also the person who, this morning, used a tactical K9 command that is not publicly documented. That is not in any open-source database. That is used by exactly 3 special operations units in the U.S. military, and the specific protocol you used, Lodestar, is associated with one of them." She leaned forward slightly. "So let's stop doing the thing where you give me the minimum and I pretend to believe it. 'Cause I don't have time for it. And honestly, from what I've read about you, I don't think you do either." Nora looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "What do you want to know?" "Everything, eventually," Tran said. "Right now, I want to know whether the name Roland Vec means anything to you." It did. Nora kept that information off her face through an act of will that she felt in her jaw. "Where did you get that name?" "From a federal investigation that's been running for 14 months, Tran said. "Vec runs a logistics and procurement company called Harlan Group officially. Unofficially, Harlan Group is a supply chain infiltration operation. They embed personnel in medical facilities, military contractors, government-adjacent institutions. They collect information. They use it to pressure people. And in at least 3 documented cases, they used it to hurt people who wouldn't be pressured." She paused. "Adrienne Calloway's crash this morning was the 4th case. Her father is the installation commander," Norrison said. "Her father has been refusing to approve a logistics contract renewal that Harlan Group needs in order to maintain access to Fort Crest's supply infrastructure. They've been pressuring him for 6 months. When he didn't respond to financial incentives, they went after his family." Tran's voice stayed level, but there was something underneath it, controlled anger, the kind that had been compressed into something useful. "We have enough to move on Vec. What we don't have is a clear picture of who inside Fort Crest's network has been feeding Harlan Group the information they need to operate. Someone gave them Adrienne's schedule. Someone told them what route she was taking and when." She looked at Nora steadily. "And someone with access to this hospital has been providing Harlan Group with patient information and staff schedules for at least the past 8 weeks. The number landed in the room between them. 8 weeks. Nora had been at Hargrove for 9. "You think someone on staff," Nora said. "I think someone with regular access to the administrative systems," Tran said. "Patient movement, or scheduling, staff rosters. Someone who knows how a hospital works from the inside and has enough institutional standing that no one questions their access." She opened the portfolio for the first time, turned it, and slid a single printed sheet across the table. "I need your help identifying who." Nora looked at the sheet. It was a list of access timestamps from Hargrove's administrative system logins to restricted areas of the scheduling database, filtered by time of day and frequency. Most of the entries were flagged in yellow. A few, toward the bottom, were flagged in red. She recognized the pattern immediately, not because she was a nurse, because she had spent 3 years in an operational context, where pattern recognition in data was the difference between a mission succeeding and a team not coming home. Her eyes moved to the name at the bottom of the most concentrated cluster of red flags. She stopped. She read it again, because she wanted to be certain before she said anything. H. Briggs, MD. She didn't say anything to Tran. Not yet. She told her she needed 24 hours. Tran pushed back, not hard, but clearly, and Nora held the line in the same way. She held most lines, which was without raising her voice or explaining herself more than once. She needed to look at something first. She would call. Tran let her go. Not because she was satisfied, but because she was smart enough to recognize that pushing harder would produce less rather than more. Nora drove home, made herself eat something she didn't taste, and sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open and the small notebook from her locker beside it. She had 9 weeks of notes. Dates, times, incidents, quotes. Every time Briggs had overridden a clinical observation. Every time he had appeared in a corridor shortly after a high-profile patient was admitted. Every time he had accessed the scheduling system at hours that didn't match his posted shifts. She had written it down because that was what she did not because she had suspected him of anything specific, but because documentation was the only form of memory that held up. She cross-referenced what she had with the timestamps on Tran's sheet. 12 of the 14 red-flagged access events matched dates she had already noted. Not because Briggs had done anything visible on those dates, but because on 7 of them she had written a single word in the margin next to his name. Early. He had arrived at the hospital before his posted time, accessed the administrative terminal in the surgical scheduling office, and left before the day shift fully populated the floor. She hadn't thought anything of it at the time. Physicians kept strange hours. Administrative access was a normal part of the job. 12 out of 14. That was not a coincidence. Pattern. She closed the laptop, looked at the ceiling, and thought about the fact that the man who had told her she was overstepping by placing an IV 30 seconds before he ordered it. It had potentially been handing patient information to a criminal network for the past 2 months. She thought about Adrian Calloway, 23 years old, lying in the surgical ICU with a ventilator breathing for her. She thought about the dog on the floor of Bay 4, still watching. Then she opened the laptop again and started writing down what she knew in the order that would make it legible to someone who hadn't been watching for 9 weeks. She was back at Hargrove by 6 the next morning, 45 minutes before her shift, which was nothing unusual. The hospital in the early morning had a different quality than it did during the day, quieter, obviously, but also more honest, somehow. Performance of busyness hadn't started yet. The people who were there at 6 in the morning were there because they had to be, not because they wanted to be seen being there. Nora stopped at the 3rd floor first. Adrian Calloway was still sedated, but the overnight numbers were better. Pressure stabilizing. Respiratory compliance improving. The ventilator settings had been dialed back slightly, which meant her lungs were picking up some of the work on their own. The SICU attending, a small, precise woman named Dr. Yolanda Ferris, looked at Nora with the expression of someone who was too tired to ask why a trauma nurse was on the surgical floor 45 minutes before her shift started. She had a stable night, Ferris said. We're cautiously optimistic about extubation in the next 48 hours. Any visitors? Her father was here until about 2 in the morning, the military security team. Ferris glanced toward the room. And the dog is still there. I stopped trying to remove him. The Malinois was in the same position he had been in the night before, lying beside Adrian's bed, head on his forepaws, watching the door. When Nora appeared in the doorway, he lifted his head, assessed her, and settled again. Good morning, she said quietly. He exhaled through his nose. That as an answer. She went back downstairs. Briggs arrived at 6:48, which was earlier than his posted start time and consistent with the pattern she had documented. He went directly to the surgical scheduling office on the 2nd floor, which was consistent with the access log. Nora was at the nursing station on the main trauma floor, where she had a clear sightline to the 2nd floor corridor through the internal stairwell window, which was something she had mapped in her first week without consciously deciding to do it. He was in the office for 11 minutes. She timed it. 7:03, he came down to the trauma floor, poured coffee from the communal pot, and looked at the board. He didn't look at Nora. He rarely did outside of situations where he needed to say something corrective. She went about her morning. The first patient of the day was a 50-year-old man with crushing chest pain that turned out, after a tense 40 minutes, to be a genuine STEMI, a full arterial blockage requiring immediate intervention. The cath lab team came down, and the patient was moved fast, and Nora had the aspirin and the heparin running before Briggs finished telling the resident to start them. She did it without comment. He didn't say anything about it either, which was different from yesterday, and the difference had a quality to it that she didn't like. He was watching her, not obviously, but she could feel the shift in his attention the same way she could feel a change in wind direction, not sensing it so much as being aware of it in a proprioceptive way that she couldn't fully explain but had learned not to ignore. At 9:15, Delk appeared on the trauma floor. He was in civilian clothes again, but he had exchanged yesterday's dark jacket for something slightly lighter, and he moved with slightly less urgency than he had the day before, which meant either the immediate situation had stabilized or he was actively working to look like it had. Nora suspected the latter. Colonel Calloway would like to speak with you, he said. When you have a moment. I have a patient. I know. When you're free. He said it with the patience of someone who was prepared to wait as long as necessary, which was itself a statement about how important the meeting was. At 10, her patient was handed off to the ICU team, and she went to the 3rd floor. Colonel Calloway was in the small waiting room outside the SICU rather than in his daughter's room. He was in civilian clothes today, dark slacks, a gray straight shirt, and he looked like he had not slept, which was true of almost everyone involved in this situation by now. There were 2 coffee cups on the table in front of him, one clearly his, one clearly for whoever he was expecting. He had planned this meeting. "Nurse Vasquez," he said, standing. "Colonel, sit, please." He gestured to the chair across from him. And she sat, and he sat, and neither of them picked up the coffee. "I owe you a direct conversation." "I'm not sure you owe me anything," Nora said. "My daughter's alive this morning because of the decisions you made in that trauma bay yesterday," he said. "Counts as something in my book." He looked at her steadily. "Also think you know more about what's happening here than you've told anyone. And I think you've spent a long time being very careful about what you tell and to whom. Respect that. But the situation has changed. Agent Tran already. Tran is running a federal investigation," Calloway said. "What I'm talking about is more immediate. Someone inside this hospital knew Adrian's schedule, knew which route she'd be driving, knew the window when she'd be alone." He paused. "That information didn't come from the installation. We've already verified the internal access audit. It came from here." "I know," Nora said. Something shifted in his expression, not surprise exactly, but a sharpening of attention. "You know, I've been documenting access irregularities since my 3rd week here," she said. "Not because I suspected anything specific. It's a habit." She pulled out her phone, where she had photographed the relevant pages from her notebook last night. She turned the screen toward him. "The pattern matches the timestamps Tran showed me. I don't have the administrative access to confirm it from within the system, but I have enough observational data to identify the source with a reasonable degree of certainty." Calloway looked at the screen. He took it from her, looked longer. His expression did not change in any dramatic way. He was too controlled for that. But she saw something move through it. The specific combination of confirmation and fury that happened when a person learned that the threat they had suspected was exactly what they feared. "Briggs," he said. "I can't confirm it absolutely," Nora said, "but the pattern is consistent." Calloway handed the phone back. "I need to make a call." He stood. "Don't go anywhere you don't normally go today. Don't access anything you don't normally access. And don't—" He stopped, looked at her with an expression that was harder to read. "How long have you been doing this, the watching?" "The documenting." "A long time," she said. "Since the 160th? The name of her old unit said aloud in a waiting room in a Colorado hospital hit her somewhere behind the sternum. She managed not to show it. "Tran told you," she said. "Tran told me enough," Calloway said. "The rest I put together." He held her gaze. "Ghost Hawk was the call sign on the extraction mission that pulled my team out of a compromised LZ in a theater. I can't name in a year that's classified. I was a major then. We lost comms, lost the primary bird, and were 6 hours past the abort window." He paused. "The pilot who came back for us flew in without instruments in a weather window that no one should have been able to navigate and got 6 of us home, and then disappeared from the record entirely." He stopped talking. Nora looked at her coffee. "I didn't know where she went," Calloway said. "For a long time I wanted to find her, to say thank you. And eventually I accepted that she didn't want to be found." He was quiet for a moment. "I understand that choice better now. I needed to be nobody for a while," Nora said. Came out more honestly than she intended. "I understand that too." He put his hand briefly on the table between them, not reaching for her hand, just placing his own there, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than comfort. "But you're not nobody. You were never nobody. And whatever's happening in this hospital right now, I'd rather have you on the right side of it than standing to the side, trying not to be noticed." Nora picked up the coffee. It was cold. She drank it anyway. "I'll need access to the administrative log system," she said. "The actual database, not just the printout Tran gave me. If Briggs has been pulling patient data, there'll be a secondary trail request routed through third-party scheduling software that the hospital uses, technically outside the main access log, which is probably why it didn't appear in the initial flag." Calloway looked at her. "You know the system well enough to know that," he said. "Spent my first week at every hospital I've ever worked at learning the system," she said. "All of it. Not just the clinical parts." He almost smiled. "I'll get you access." The access came through at 1:15, authorized through the hospital administrator's office, under the pretext of a federal records compliance review. Nora sat in a small office on the administrative floor, a room she had identified in week 1 as underutilized, and therefore frequently empty, with a laptop connected to the hospital's internal network, and 3 hours before her afternoon, patients needed attention. She found what she was looking for in 47 minutes. The secondary scheduling software, a third-party platform called MedLink Ops, used primarily by surgical coordinators and department chiefs, had its own access log that operated independently from the main hospital system. It was less carefully monitored precisely because it was considered administrative rather than clinical. Patient information flowed through it in the form of procedure scheduling, post-operative movement, and discharge planning. Briggs had accessed MedLink Ops 41 times in the past 8 weeks. 26 of those accesses had occurred outside his normal operating hours. And in 17 cases, the specific patient files he had accessed were patients with confirmed military affiliations, either active duty, veteran status, or family members of installation personnel. Adrienne Calloway's file had been accessed 4 days before her crash. Nora sat with that for a moment. 4 days. Someone had run the crash timeline with a 4-day planning window, which meant this was not a reactive operation. Vex Network had been given enough lead time to organize, surveil, and execute. And the person who had given them that lead time had done it from a computer in this building, using credentials he was authorized to have that, in a system that no one had been monitoring closely enough. She photographed the screen. 17 photographs. Methodical. Complete. Then she opened a secure message to Tran's contact number and typed, "Found the secondary trail. 17 confirmed accesses outside normal parameters. Calloway file accessed 4 days pre-incident. I have screenshots. Meet me at 6. The reply came in 4 minutes where Nora typed the name of a coffee shop 2 blocks from the hospital that she had gone to exactly once, chosen specifically because it had no connection to her routine, and therefore no connection to anyone who might be watching her routine. Then she closed the laptop, cleaned the desk to exactly the condition she had found it, and went back to work. The afternoon ran the way afternoons sometimes did, multiple things happening at once, none of them individually manageable, but collectively, just within the range of what a good team could hold together. 2 MVAs came in within 30 minutes of each other. Pediatric respiratory case required a consult that took longer than it should have because the relevant specialist was in a procedure. An elderly patient in bed 3 became agitated and needed a level of individual attention that pulled Nora from 2 other things she was managing simultaneously. She handled it. Not smoothly. There was a moment around 3:30 where she was holding a phone, a chart, and a medication syringe at the same time, while trying to answer a question from a resident who should have known the answer, but she handled it, and the patients were okay, and that was the metric that mattered. Briggs was present for parts of it. He moved through the afternoon with his usual efficiency, directing the residents, making the decisions that were visibly his to make, performing the role with the kind of practiced authority that she had spent 9 weeks recognizing as performance without being able to articulate what was underneath it. Now she knew what was underneath it. At 4:50, something happened that she had not anticipated. Briggs came to her. He appeared at the charting station, where she was finishing notes on the second MVA patient, and he stood in the way he stood when he wanted to seem casual, but wasn't, and he said, "Do you have a minute?" She looked up. "I'm in the middle of charting." "After you finish," he said. "My office." "I finish at 6, he said. "Quest." He walked away. Nora looked at the chart in front of her and did not move for approximately 5 seconds. Then she finished the entry, saved it, and sent a text to Delk's number, the one he had given her the previous day, that said only, "Briggs wants to meet privately," flagging for awareness. The reply was immediate. "Do not go alone. I'll be in the second-floor corridor." She went to Briggs's office at 5:15. He was behind his desk when she arrived, which was a choice putting furniture between them, keeping the physical authority of the space. He had a file open in front of him that she couldn't read from the doorway. "Close the door," he said. She left it open 6 inches. "Hospital policy for private meetings with staff," she said. "Prefer to follow it." His jaw tightened. "Sit down. Stand." He looked at her for a moment. Then he closed the file. "I'm going to ask you something directly, and I'd appreciate a direct answer. Have you been speaking to federal agents about this hospital?" The room was very still. "That's a specific question," Nora said. "The one I'm asking. Why would federal agents be interested in Hargrove Medical Center?" she said. His expression shifted in a way that was small and fast and extremely informative. He hadn't expected her to redirect. He had expected either denial or confirmation, and she had given him neither. And the recalibration it required Took just long enough to tell her that he was operating under he was trying not to show. There are some people asking questions about administrative access, he said carefully, about scheduling records. I want to understand the scope of that inquiry. I think that's a question for administration, Nora said. I'm asking you. I heard you, they said. My answer is the same. He stood up. He was taller than her, and he used that the way some men did, not aggressively but deliberately, letting the physical difference do a kind of work. Vasquez. I know you've had some adjustment challenges fitting into this department. I know the transition hasn't been easy, and I want you to understand that I'm prepared to be supportive if you're prepared to be straightforward with me. Portive. After 9 weeks of being told she was overstepping, of being corrected in front of residents, of watching him take credit for observations she had made first. The words sat in the room between them, like something deposited there without permission. I appreciate that, she said, in a tone that conveyed the opposite. Is there anything clinical you needed to discuss? Stared at her. That'll be all, he said. She walked out. In the second-floor corridor, Delk was leaning against the wall near the elevator, with his arms crossed and his eyes on the office door. Straightened when she appeared. How'd it go? He said low. He's scared, she said. He doesn't know exactly what we have, but he knows someone is looking. She kept walking. He's going to do something tonight. Try to clean something. Reach someone. Move. People in his position always do. We can put eyes on him, Delk said. Don't tip him yet, she said. If he knows we're moving, he might warn Vec. We need the network, not just Briggs. Delk looked at her with an expression that had moved past the initial assessment of the day before into something closer to respect, though he was careful about showing it. Tran's not going to love that call. Tran is smart, Nora said. She'll understand the logic. She went to the locker room, changed back into her street clothes, and checked the time. 5:48. She had 12 minutes before the coffee shop meeting. She was pulling on her jacket when the overhead PA crackled. Code Blue SICU Bay 4. Code Blue SICU Bay 4. The words hit her before she had time to process them. 4. Adrian. She was running before the PA finished, through the locker room door, down the main corridor, toward the stairwell, because the stairwell was faster than the elevator, and she knew every shortcut in this building by heart, had mapped them the way she mapped everything. The way she had been mapping things since long before she was a nurse, and she hit the third-floor landing at a speed that made the door bang against the wall, and she came through the SICU entrance to find 3 nurses and the overnight resident working the crash cart on Adrian's bed, and the Malinois pressed against the far wall, with his ears flat, watching, making no sound at all. What happened? Nora said. VFib, the resident said. She converted on her own from the vent strap, but her pressure dropped hard, came back up, and then she arrested. He was running the code the way residents ran codes, when the attending wasn't there yet efficiently, but with the specific kind of focused anxiety that came from knowing the person in charge of the room was supposed to be someone else. I've got epinephrine on board. We're cycling. When did she convert? 3 minutes ago. She was stable through afternoon rounds, and then her HR spiked and dropped, and what changed between rounds and now? Nora moved to the bedside, looked at the monitor, looked at the ventilator settings, looked at the medication lines. Everything was where it should be. Everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to look, which was wrong, because if everything was where it was supposed to be, Adrian should not have arrested. She looked at the IV bag. The main fluid line was saline, unchanged. The secondary port had a medication line running in a low-dose vasopressor that had been on the order since post-op. Standard. Expected. But the tubing on the secondary line had a small, nearly invisible imperfection in it. Slight discoloration, maybe 2 inches above the port where it connected to the IV catheter. So slight that under the ICU's overhead lighting, in the controlled chaos of a code, no one would have seen it. Nora saw it. She reached across the bed and clamped the secondary line. What are you doing? The resident said. Clamp this line and replace it, she said. Right now. New bag, new tubing, new port. She's in the middle of a code. I know she's in the middle of a code, Nora said. Place the line. He hesitated for half a second. Then something in her voice, not volume, not aggression, just the absolute absence of uncertainty, made him move. He reached for the supply cart. The SICU attending doctor, Ferris, came through the door, at a run, 30 seconds later, took in the room, and looked at Nora. Expected line contamination, Nora said. Secondary port. I've clamped it and we're replacing. Ferris moved to the monitor, assessed the rhythm, assessed the patient. What made you the tubing? Nora said. There's a discoloration. I don't know what was introduced, but something was. Ferris looked at the clamped line. Get Tox on the phone. Get pharmacy. And someone get security up here right now. The crash cart cycled again. The monitor showed V-fib holding, then a long second a junctional rhythm, then sinus, unstable sinus, heart rate 62, but sinus. Adrian's blood pressure climbed back toward something survivable. Ferris exhaled through her nose. Keep cycling. I want to repeat lights, magnesium, and a portable echo in this room in 10 minutes. She turned to Nora. You need to stay. I need you to walk me through everything you saw. I know, Nora said. But what she was thinking, as Adrian's monitor slowly steadied and the SICU team regrouped around her, was that someone had been inside this room. Not during the code, after it would have been too late. Before. During the window between afternoon rounds and the code call. Someone has accessed Bay 4 while the ICU was running at its regular rhythm, and they had done something to a medication line in a way that was designed to look like equipment failure rather than intent. Someone who knew exactly how the SICU ran, exactly when the staffing was thinnest. The dog had not reacted. She looked at the Malinois, still pressed against the far wall. He was watching Adrian, not the door, which meant whoever had come into this room had done so in a window before the Malinois arrived, or had done it in a way that didn't trigger his alert threshold, or had done it in a way that looked completely authorized. Security arrived. Then Delk, 90 seconds behind them. Then Calloway himself, moving faster than a man his age should have been able to move, coming through the SICU doors, with Delk's hand on his arm, trying to keep him from going directly to Adrian's bedside before the medical team cleared the space. She's stable, Nora said. She's going to be stable. But someone was in this room. Calloway looked at her, then at the clamped line, then at his daughter on the bed, with the monitor showing a rhythm that was imperfect and irregular and alive. Briggs, he said. It wasn't a question. I don't know yet, Nora said. But someone with access and knowledge of this floor's schedule. Someone who knew the precise window. Delk stepped close to her. His office. He left the building at 5:38. I had eyes on the corridor. I watched him go. But he was on this floor between 5:20 and 5:32. He said it quietly, just for her. I didn't flag it at the time, because physicians make rounds. Nora stared at him. 12 minutes. Between her conversation in his office and his departure from the building, Briggs had had 12 minutes, and he had spent part of them on the 3rd floor. She thought about the way he had looked at her across his desk, the word supportive sitting between them, like something deposited without permission. He hadn't been trying to warn her. He had been stalling her. Call Tran, Nora said to Delk. Right now. And tell her we need everything locked down his office. His computer, his car, his phone records before he has any more time to move. She looked back at Adrian on the bed. He just tried to finish what the crash didn't. The SICU was very quiet for a moment, except for the sound of the ventilator and the monitor and the low, steady breathing of a dog pressed against a wall, watching the door with the focused, unblinking attention of an animal that had been trained to guard what mattered most. And Nora stood in the middle of it, no longer trying to be the person nobody noticed, understanding for the first time in 4.5 years that the reason she was standing in this room on this night was not coincidence and not accident. She had spent years trying to become invisible. Someone had needed her to be exactly who she was. Toxicology results came back at 7:41 the following morning, and they were not what anyone had expected. Not because the substance was exotic, it wasn't. It was a synthetic potassium compound, the kind used in specific cardiac protocols, available through any hospital pharmacy with the right authorization codes. That was precisely what made it so calculated. Whoever had introduced it into Adrian's secondary line had used something that belonged in a hospital, something that would metabolize in the bloodstream without flagging immediately on a standard panel, something that would produce a cardiac event that looked in the wrong light, like a complication of her injuries, rather than an intervention. If Nora had not clamped that line when she did, the conversation the next morning would have been about the tragedy of a young woman who had survived a vehicle collision, only to succumb to cardiac arrhythmia during recovery. Ferris relayed the tox findings in the SICU consultation room with a stillness that told Nora she had already processed her own anger and come out the other side of it. Calloway was there. Delk was in the corridor. Tran had arrived at the hospital at 6:15 and had been conducting interviews on the administrative floor since 6:30. Compound was introduced through the secondary port, Ferris said. Based on the concentration and the timing of the arrhythmia, introduction occurred somewhere between 4:50 and 5:20 p.m. That window corresponds to the staffing transition between the afternoon and evening SICU teams. She set the report on the table. It would have taken less than 2 minutes to do. Someone with clinical knowledge, the right credentials, and a window of approximately 8 to 10 minutes would have had enough time to access the room, make the introduction, and leave without being logged as an anomaly. Briggs left the building at 5:38, Calloway said. He was on this floor in the prior window. His badge log shows he accessed the SICU corridor at 5:21, Tran said from the doorway. She had apparently finished at least one interview and returned. She had the portfolio under her arm and the reading glasses on her forehead and the controlled, pressurized pulse of someone who had been awake for 36 hours and was running on something more durable than caffeine. He didn't enter the bay. The door sensor shows no entry. Corridor access puts him within 30 feet of Bay 4 during the critical window. He didn't have to enter the bay, Nora said. The others looked at her. The secondary medication line runs from a wall-mounted pump. In Bay 4, the pump is positioned near the interior wall, which means the line feeds toward the bed from the far side. If someone were standing in the corridor near the bay window, the interior observation window, not the exterior, they would have access to the pump interface without technically crossing the room threshold. Silence. The door sensor wouldn't log a corridor presence, Ferris said slowly. No, Nora said. It wouldn't. Tran looked at her for a moment. How do you know the pump placement in Bay 4? I know the placement of every pump on this floor, Nora said. I know the placement of every pump in this building. It's a safety thing. She paused. It's a habit. Tran did not ask a follow-up question about the habit. She made a note instead. The meeting concluded with a list of next steps that Tran managed with the efficient brevity of someone who knew what needed to happen and was going to make it happen, whether the room was on board or not. Briggs had not yet been located. He had left the building the previous evening and had not responded to calls from the hospital administration. His home address had been visited by 2 federal agents at 10:30 the previous night. No answer, no vehicle in the driveway. He had not used his credit cards since 5:47 p.m. He was running, which was, Nora thought, both the most predictable thing and the most damaging. A man who stayed and stonewalled could be managed. A man who ran confirmed every conclusion that had been drawn about him, and added several new ones, including the conclusion that he knew the investigation had gotten close enough to move. She had triggered that. The conversation in his office. She had not tipped anything directly. She was certain of that, but she had shown him that she was not the person he had spent nine weeks assuming her to be, and that alone had been enough. She went to her shift. The trauma floor on a Wednesday morning was a thing unto itself, indifferent to everything happening above it on the 3rd floor. 2 new admissions before 9. A follow-up from the previous day's STEMI patient who was now in the cardiac care unit and whose family needed to speak with someone. A medication error caught by the pharmacy team that required documentation and conversation with the overnight resident who had made it an exhausted 3rd year, who had been awake for too long and needed the conversation to stay corrective rather than punitive, which Nora managed by remembering what it felt like to be responsible for something that went wrong in a high-stakes environment and have someone take it apart in front of you. She told him what she would have wanted to hear, which was, you caught it before it reached the patient. That counts. Write it down, understand why it happened, and don't do it again. He looked slightly less hollowed out after that. At 10:20, doctor. Pamela O.C. found Nora at the medication cart. O.C. had been Briggs's senior resident for 2 years, competent, careful, with the particular combination of exhaustion and suppressed resentment that accumulated in people who were talented and working under someone who made sure they knew their place in the hierarchy. She had never been unkind to Nora. She had also never been an ally. She had existed in the professional middle distance, performing the required collegiality without investing in it. She looked different this morning. They're saying, doctor. Briggs isn't coming in, she said. Her voice was low. Administration sent an email. It said extended personal leave. Nobody believes that. I don't know anything official, Nora said. The federal agents have been in his office since this morning, O.C. said. That's not personal leave. Nora looked at her. Pamela, whatever you're trying to figure out, whether you need to be worried about your own position, whether you knew something you should have flagged, you should talk to Agent Tran. She's on the administrative floor. She's going to be fair. Osi stared at her. How do you know she's going to be fair? Because she's trying to find out who hurt a 23-year-old woman, Nora said. Thing she cares about. Not collecting collateral damage. Osi was quiet for a moment. Something moved across her face, not quite relief, not quite decision, but the edge of both. I saw him on the SICU floor yesterday afternoon, she said quietly. Around 5:15. I didn't think anything of it at the time. He does consults up there. But he wasn't carrying anything. He wasn't in scrubs. He was just moving through. Tell Tran, Nora said. Osi nodded once. Then she walked toward the elevator. Nora went back to the medication cart. Her hands were steady. She had learned to keep them that way. Call from Tran came at 11:52. We found him, she said. No preamble. Briggs. He's at a property registered to an LLC in Boulder. Took us until this morning to trace the ownership chain. We have agents there now. A pause shorter than usual. But there's a complication. What kind? The kind that means we may not be able to hold the full case together if we move before we have Vex Network fully documented. Tran's voice had a quality in it that Nora had not heard before, not hesitation exactly, more like the sounds of someone recalculating in real time. If we arrest Briggs now, Vec will know within hours. He'll pull his operators out of the 3 other facilities we've identified, destroy whatever documentation he hasn't already sanitized, and we lose the network. We get one man who will lawyer up immediately and tell us nothing. A beat. If we wait another 48 hours, we have enough to move on the full operation simultaneously. Adrian nearly died last night, Nora said. I know. He knows we're close. He tried to kill her when he knew we were close. If he has any remaining access to someone inside this hospital, he doesn't, Tran said. We've confirmed he's isolated at the Boulder property. He hasn't made contact with anyone inside Hargrove since he left last night. We're monitoring all his communication channels. You're monitoring the ones you know about. Another pause. Yes. Nora leaned against the wall of the medication room, which was empty, and looked at the ceiling, and thought about what 48 hours meant in practical terms. Adrian in the SCCU with an upgraded security detail. The Malinois still on the floor beside her bed. Calloway managing his fury with the controlled precision of a man who had spent decades in environments where fury that wasn't managed got people killed. What do you need from me? Nora said. I need you to keep doing exactly what you're doing, Tran said. Keep your access to the administrative system. Keep documenting. And if anything changes in the hospital, anything that suggests another Harland operative has access, call me directly. Don't go through the security desk. Understood. Vasquez. A pause. You found the secondary trail in 47 minutes. Team spent 4 weeks on the primary log. She said it without inflation, simply as a fact. I want you to know I see that. Nora didn't say anything for a moment. Thank you, she said, because it was true, and because she had not had occasion to say it very often. She went back to work. The 48 hours began. They were not quiet nothing. In a trauma center was ever quiet, but they were dense, in the way that waiting was always dense, when you knew something was coming and couldn't accelerate the timeline, without breaking something that needed to hold together. Nora moved through her shifts with the surface presentation of a nurse who was doing her job, which she was, and the interior engagement of someone running multiple tracks simultaneously, which she also was. Adrian was improving. Not dramatically, not in the way that felt like victory. She remained tubated through the first day. And the extubation attempt on the afternoon of the second day resulted in a brief desaturation that required reintubation, which was a setback that Ferris called manageable, and Calloway received with a stillness that Nora recognized as the adult version of not being allowed to fall apart. But her numbers were trending correctly. The arrhythmia had not recurred. Toxicology team confirmed the compound had cleared her system without permanent cardiac damage. She was going to recover. Nora visited the room once each shift, not as a clinical obligation. She had no official role in Adrian's care, but because the Malinois had started looking for her each time she entered the SICU, lifting his head and tracking her movement in the specific way he tracked people he had decided to trust. She was not sentimental about animals. She had worked with military dogs in operational contexts where they were tools and skilled ones, and she had understood their value without anthropomorphizing it. But there was something about the way this particular dog had decided she was safe that she found, in the margins of everything else, quietly steadying. On the morning of the second day, Delk was waiting outside the SCCU when she arrived. He was carrying 2 coffees, which was notable because Delk did not strike her as a man who made gestures without purpose. He handed her one without asking. Tran moved the timeline, he said. Forward or back? Tonight. He looked past her toward the SICU doors. They got a communication intercept this morning. Vec has a contact inside the Fort Crest contracting office, separate from Briggs, lower level, been there for 2 years. The contact sent a message at 4 this morning indicating that Briggs's disappearance had been noticed internally and people were asking questions that shouldn't be asked. He paused. Vec is going to pull out tonight. If they don't move by 7 p.m., they lose the network. So they're moving at 6. Nora looked at her watch. It was 8:14 in the morning. Does Calloway know? He's being briefed now. Delk looked at her with the directness that she had come to understand, was simply how he communicated. Tran wants you on seats for the Briggs arrest, as a witness, and to provide clinical context for any medical records questions that come up during the search. He paused. It's voluntary. You're not obligated. I know, Nora said. Yes. She drank the coffee. It was better than the hospital coffee by a significant margin. One more thing, Delk said. Tran pulled the full version of your service record this morning, the unredacted version. He was watching her face with the careful neutrality of someone delivering information and trying to leave space for whatever the response was. Not because she needed it for the case. She said, and I'm quoting here, that she wanted to understand who she was working with. And Nora said, she said to tell you that the Ridgeway extraction is in the record, Delk said. Full account. The part that was classified above Colonel Calloway's clearance level. He paused. She said you should know that. Nora said nothing for a moment. The Ridgeway extraction had been the last mission she flew before she left the 160th. It had also been the one that had made leaving feel necessary, not because it had failed, but because of how close it had come to failing in a way she still hadn't fully processed, and because of what she had learned in the debrief about why the mission had been so compromised to begin with. Someone inside the operational chain had fed targeting information to the wrong people. She had reported it. The report had been received, documented, and quietly buried by someone above her pay grade. She had been told, in terms that were technically polite and substantively unmistakable, that pursuing it further would be counterproductive for her career. She had left instead. She had spent 4.5 years building a life that was entirely ordinary, not because she was afraid, because she had needed to be somewhere that the damage she was carrying didn't put other people at risk. And now Tran had the full record. She knows why I left, Nora said. Question. Yes, Delk said. Does Calloway? Not yet. He paused. That's your call. Nora finished the coffee. She crumpled the cup, looked for a trash can, didn't find one, and held the cup in her hand because there was nowhere to put it. Small, stupid detail. The kind that happened constantly in the spaces between the things that mattered. Tell Tran, I'll be at the staging location by 4. He nodded. I'll let her know. She had not been in a tactical briefing room in 4.5 years, and the muscle memory of it was uncomfortable in a specific way, not fear, but the particular re-engagement of a way of holding her body and processing information that she had deliberately let go quiet. The Boulder property was a rental house on the edge of a residential area, registered to an LLC that traced back through 4 entities to a company incorporated in Nevada that had no visible connection to Harlan Group until you looked at the shared registered agent, which Tran's team had identified that morning. Briggs had been tracked via cell signal, which he had apparently not thought to disable, to within 300 meters of the property. A physical surveillance team had visual confirmation of his presence as of 2:18 p.m. Tran ran the briefing with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times. 4 federal agents would approach the property. 2 were positioned for rear exit coverage. Local law enforcement had been notified and would hold a perimeter. The Fort Crest legal team had the paperwork. The goal was a clean arrest, not just Briggs, but Briggs with his devices intact, before he had time to wipe anything. Nora was not going in. That was clear and correct. She was there to provide immediate clinical or records context if the search produced medical documentation she could identify, and to be available for Tran as a subject matter resource. She sat in the staging vehicle 3 blocks from the property and watched the clock move. At 5:47, Tran's earpiece produced something. Nora couldn't hear it, but she watched Tran's face change in the small, controlled way that trained faces changed when something went wrong, and Tran said, "Wait." One word. Everyone in the vehicle held. "We have a second vehicle at the property," Tran said. "Unknown occupant. Arrived in the past 6 minutes. We're running the plate. 30 seconds. Plate comes back to a rental company. Rented yesterday under an alias that flags us against our Harlan Group database." She was quiet for a moment. "Vec sent someone. They're already there." Nora felt the calculation change in real time. Briggs alone was manageable. Briggs with a Harland operator was a different scenario, not because it was necessarily more dangerous, but because it meant Vec already knew the timeline had moved, which meant someone had communicated that to him in the past several hours, through a channel that Tran's monitoring had not caught. "Go now or wait," the lead agent said through the earpiece. Tran looked at Nora, not for permission. For something else, the clinical red of someone who had been in situations where the decision window was compressed, and the calculus was human rather than procedural. "If you wait," Briggs panics, Nora said. "He doesn't have the operational training to hold in a room with a handler who's there to potentially extract him. He'll make noise. He'll create a reason for someone to call 911. He'll do something that forces your hand at a worse moment. Go now." Tran keyed her radio. "Move." The next 4 minutes were the specific combination of very fast and very long that Nora recognized from operational experience. The briefing team moved toward the property. Tran monitored audio. Staging vehicle held position. Nora sat with her hands in her lap and her breathing controlled and her attention on the information coming through the vehicle's radio feed. A door. Voices, 2 male overlapping. Then a third female voice that was an agent announcing federal identification. Crash, something knocked over, or someone going through a door they shouldn't have. Shouting, the kind that was tactical rather than panicked. Then quiet. Then Tran's lead agent, "Structure is secure. We have Briggs. The Harland operator is in custody. No injuries." Tran closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then she opened them and keyed the radio. "Copy. Preserve all devices. I'm coming in." The vehicle moved. Property was a nondescript rental house that smelled like takeout containers and anxiety, and Briggs looked worse than Nora had expected. Not physically injured, the agents had been careful, but compressed. Particular compression of a man who had been holding something together through will alone and had just watched it stop holding. He was sitting at the kitchen table in handcuffs when Tran entered, and when Nora came in behind her, something happened to his face that she had not anticipated. Not anger, not defiance. Something that looked, underneath everything, like relief. She understood that, even though she didn't want to. The Harland operator, a compact woman in her 30s who had given no name and appeared to have no intention of giving one, was in the back room with 2 agents and the particular practiced silence of someone who had been trained for exactly this scenario. Her profile was already running through Tran's Washington contacts. Whoever she was, whatever she knew, she was not going to give it voluntarily. Briggs was a different calculation. Tran sat across from him at the kitchen table without preamble or performance. "Dr. Briggs, you understand why you're here?" "Yes," he said. His voice was flat. "What I need from you right now, before anything else, is a single answer. Did you introduce a substance into patient Adrian Calloway's medication line on the evening of—" "I want a lawyer," he said. "That's your right, and we'll accommodate it. But I'm asking you a yes or no question about an attempted homicide, and your answer in the next 30 seconds will materially affect every decision that follows." He looked at the table. "I didn't know what they were going to do with the information I gave them at the beginning. But you knew eventually." He didn't answer. "The hospital," Tran said. "Yesterday evening, the SECU." A long pause. "I need a lawyer," he said again. But it came out smaller this time. Less as a right being invoked and more as a door he was hoping still led somewhere useful. Nora stayed near the entrance to the kitchen, outside the immediate conversation, and watched him. She had tried, in the car on the way over, to work out what she felt about Harlan Briggs, and the answer was more complicated than she would have preferred. She did not feel sorry for him. She felt contempt for the specific kind of cowardice that looked like arrogance for years before the mechanism underneath it became visible. She felt something colder than anger about Adrian on the bed with a compromised medication line. But she also felt, and this was the part she didn't particularly like a kind of recognition she hadn't asked for. He had been pressured, leveraged, caught in something that probably started smaller than it ended. She knew something about what it looked like when a system pressed down on a person and the person made the wrong choice in response. She had made the right choice. He hadn't. That difference was everything. But she understood the moment of the fork in the road, and understanding it didn't feel like forgiveness. It felt like clarity. Tran concluded the initial interview and stepped out. She found Nora in the front room, beside the window, watching the federal vehicles in the street below. He's going to deal, Tran said. He doesn't have anywhere else to go, and he knows it. She stood beside Nora. The Harland operator is a harder problem. But if Briggs gives us the communication chain, we may not need her to cooperate. Vec, Nora said. The simultaneous arrests went through at 6:03, Tran said. 4 Harland Group locations, including the headquarters facility in Denver. We have Vec in custody. She paused. I wanted to tell you that directly. Nora looked out at the street, the vehicles, the agents moving in and out of the property. Ordinary neighborhood going about its evening around the edges of something it didn't know was happening. And the Fort Crest contact, she said. The one in the contracting office. Rested at 5:58. Tran glanced at her. Communication intercept that moved our timeline. It came through a secondary channel we hadn't mapped a personal email account. The kind of channel you'd use if you assumed your primary communications were monitored. Smart, Nora said. Smart enough, Tran said. Not smart enough. A pause. We identified it because the message referenced a specific internal Hargrove protocol that is not publicly documented. The only way a Harlan contact could have known that protocol was if they'd gotten it from someone inside the hospital in the past 48 hours, after Briggs left. After Briggs left, Tran confirmed, which means there's a secondary source. Someone who wasn't Briggs. Someone who's still inside Hargrove Medical Center. She turned to look at Nora directly. Someone who knew enough to use a specific protocol reference that only clinical staff would recognize. Nora felt something shift in her thinking. Not dramatic. A small, precise shift of a piece of information finding its correct position in a map she had been building for 2 days. Thought about 9 weeks of mornings. 9 weeks of watching who came in early, who accessed what, who moved through which corridors. Not just Briggs. She thought about the medication error from yesterday morning. The one caught by pharmacy, the third-year resident exhausted and chastened. She thought about who had been on shift during every single window that Adrian Calloway's information had been accessed in the MedLink system. Not just when Briggs had accessed it, the other 12 times. The 7 times she had logged as early in her notebook because the access pattern was unusual, but she had flagged it under Briggs's name because he was the attending and the timestamps clustered around his. They had clustered around his. They hadn't been exclusively his. She was already pulling out her phone, already opening the photograph she had taken of the access log screenshots, already running her eyes down the secondary timestamp column she had flagged but not fully cross-referenced because she had found the Briggs pattern first and stopped drilling. 3 of the 14 red-flagged accesses did not match Briggs's access window. They matched a different login credential entirely. She looked at the credential identifier. It was a 4-character alphanumeric code, the kind the hospital used for non-physician clinical staff. She had the staff directory in her email. She had pulled it in week 1, same as she pulled everything, the way she always did. She cross-referenced the code. The name that came back made her stop breathing for a moment, not because it was someone she disliked, not because it was someone she had suspected, because it was someone she had trusted, someone who had been in the narrow geography of 9 difficult weeks at Hargrove Medical Center, one of the only people who had treated her like a professional rather than a subordinate, someone who had access to the SICU, who knew the floor schedule, who had been present during rounds the afternoon, before the medication line incident, who had, now that she was running the timeline backward, with this new information, been in proximity to every single critical moment in this case. Nora's phone buzzed in her hand. A text. From a number she recognized as the SEU charge desk. Calloway's daughter is awake. Asking for the nurse with the dog. Nora read it twice. Then she looked up at Tran and said, "We have a problem, and it's still inside the hospital." She turned the phone screen toward Tran so she could see the credential match. Tran looked at the name, and for the first time in 2 days, Irish Tran's composure cracked in a way that was small and total, and told Nora everything she needed to know about how badly this second name was going to complicate what everyone had spent 48 hours believing was almost over. The name on the credential log was Sandra Breck, overnight charge nurse, 9 years at Hargrove Medical Center. The woman who had given Nora the look that meant you can leave now, I've got it on the evening, Adrian Calloway, was admitted. The woman who had been at the handoff desk every single time Nora had passed the nursing station during the critical window shifts. The woman who had, without drawing any attention to herself whatsoever, been exactly where she needed to be for every access event that didn't belong to Briggs. Tran stared at the name for 3 seconds. Then she was on the radio. I need a status check on Hargrove Medical Center, 3rd floor SCU. Do we have eyes on the overnight charge nurse Sandra Breck, BRECK? She should be coming on shift in the next hour. She listened. Someone to that floor right now. Quietly. Do not approach her. She lowered the radio and looked at Nora. How long has she been on your radar? She hasn't been, Nora said. And that was the honest answer, and it was the part that bothered her most. 9 weeks of documenting. 9 weeks of watching. And Sandra Breck had been invisible to her in exactly the way Nora herself had spent years trying to be invisible to everyone else. The credential match only appeared when I cross-referenced the secondary timestamp column. Stopped at Briggs because his pattern was obvious. The secondary accesses were quieter, fewer, shorter duration, spread across a longer window so they didn't cluster the same way. She's been at this longer than Briggs, Tran said. Question. The first flagged access under her credential is from 6 weeks before his earliest one, Nora said. She may have been the one who recruited him, or at minimum, the one who identified him as a viable asset. Tran processed that, without visible reaction. She knows the case has moved. The communication intercept, the one that referenced the internal protocol that went out this morning. If she sent it and she's been monitoring the situation, she knows Briggs was arrested tonight. She'll know within hours if she doesn't already. She comes on shift at 8, Nora said. 7:19. I know. Tran was already moving toward the door. We need to be back at Hargrove before she arrives. If she walks into that building knowing the arrest happened, she'll sanitize anything she has on the floor and walk out clean. She stopped. Or she'll do something else entirely. Nora thought about the SICU, about Adrian, awake now, asking for the nurse with the dog, about the Malinois on the floor of Bay 4, who had decided she was safe but could not distinguish between the people in Hargrove who deserved that designation and the ones who didn't. She'll do something else, Nora said. They were in the vehicle. In 4 minutes. The drive back to Fort Crest took 22 minutes at that hour, and Tran spent most of it on the phone. Nora sat in the back seat and thought about Sandra Breck in the specific, schematic way she thought about operational problems, not emotionally, not yet, but architecturally. Who she was, what she knew, what she had access to, and what she would do with it in the window between learning Briggs was gone and deciding what to do next. 9 years at Hargrove. That was not a short-term embed. That was either a very long-running operation or a person who had been recruited mid-career, someone who had been in position already and been approached when Harlan Group identified the institutional access she represented. Given that the earliest access log entry under her credential predated Briggs by 6 weeks and predated Vec's formal identification as a target by 4 months, Nora was increasingly certain it was the latter. Someone had looked at Hargrove's nursing staff roster, identified a charge nurse with 9 years of institutional access and administrative system privileges, and made an approach. Question was what Sandra Breck had agreed to, and what she had done when the agreement expanded beyond whatever she had originally been told. Some people, when they understood the full scope of what they were involved in, found a way to believe they were not responsible for it, that the harm that happened further down the chain wasn't theirs because they had only provided information, not action. Nora had seen that construction before, not personally, but in the operational debrief context she had spent years trying to process and then set aside. It was a coherent lie. It was the lie that made possible. It was the lie that made Briggs possible, and it was the same lie that would be at the center of whatever Sandra Breck told herself about the 23-year-old woman in Bay 4 with a compromised medication line. She had provided the schedule. She had provided the access information. She had provided, very likely, the specific internal protocol reference that had tipped Vec that morning. Whether she had known what Briggs would do with the ICU access was a question for lawyers and investigators. What she knew and what she had chosen was enough. Tran ended her final call as the vehicle pulled into Hargrove's staff entrance. "We have 2 agents inside already, plainclothes, positioned on the 2nd floor and in the ICU corridor. There are 2 more in the parking structure." She looked at Nora. "Adrian Calloway has a military security detail in her room. She's safe regardless of what happens in the next hour." "Calloway?" "He's been briefed. He's staying in the waiting room on 3 per my request." A pause. "He was not happy about that." "No," Nora said. "He wouldn't be." They entered through the staff entrance, badged through, and took the stairs. Nora went to the nursing station on the trauma floor first, because arriving at the SICU immediately would break her pattern, and anything that broke her pattern tonight was a signal she couldn't afford to send. She checked the board, signed into the system, exchanged 12 words with the evening charge nurse about a patient in Bay 3, whose potassium was trending low. She looked like a nurse doing her job, because she was a nurse doing her job. 7:51, Sandra Breck walked through the staff entrance. Nora knew this because Tran, stationed in the administrative corridor with a sightline to the entry camera feed, sent a single-word text in. Nora typed back, "SCU or floor first?" 30 seconds. "Floor." Moving toward nursing station. Standard. Sandra Breck was following her exact normal pattern, badging in, heading to the charge desk to receive the shift handoff. Nothing visible in her behavior that would flag to anyone who didn't know what to look for, which was, Nora thought, what 9 years of practice looked like. She stayed at the trauma floor station. She did not go upstairs. She let 2 minutes pass, then 3, monitoring the text thread from Tran. Shift handoff complete. She's moving to the medication room. Now heading to elevator. 3rd floor. Nora moved. She took the internal stairwell faster, and it deposited her at the 3rd floor landing through a door that was 30 feet from this ICU's entrance, but angled in a way that allowed approach without being immediately visible from the main corridor. She came through it quietly and scanned the hallway. Sandra Breck was at the SICU nursing station, 20 feet from Bay 4. She was holding a tablet, the standard charge nurse tablet, that contained the floor schedule, the bed assignments, the medication administration records. She was looking at it with the focused attention of someone reviewing handoff notes. Her back was to Nora. One of Tran's plainclothes agents, a tall man in a gray jacket who had been sitting in the family waiting area at the corridor's end, was on his feet. Tran herself emerged from the elevator behind Nora 11 seconds later. Timing was not clean. Nora had not been told to move. She had moved because the weight of the moment had made waiting feel like a calculation she didn't want to have made for her, and because 9 weeks of watching Sandra Breck manage this floor with the practiced ease of someone who owned it had produced in her a specific, non-negotiable need to be present when that ended. Breck looked up. She saw Nora first. Something happened to her face, the same small, fast recalibration Nora had seen in Briggs's office, but more controlled, more experienced. Breck was better at this. She had been doing it longer. "Vasquez," she said, "neutral." "Professional, Sandra," Nora said. A beat of silence. In that beat, Breck's eyes moved not to Tran, not to the agent in the gray jacket, but to the door of Bay 4. A reflex, quickly suppressed. But Nora had been watching for exactly that. "I need to review the overnight medication administration for Bay 4, Breck said. She said it calmly, addressing the statement to the SICU charge nurse, who was standing nearby looking confused. "No," Nora said. Breck looked at her. "Nurse Vasquez, I'm the overnight charge on this floor." "Not tonight," Nora said. Tran stepped forward. "Sandra Breck, I'm Special Agent Iris Tran, Federal Investigative Division. I need you to step away from that desk." She produced her identification. "Right now, please." Breck looked at the ID, looked at Tran, looked at the agent in the gray jacket, who had moved to close the distance between them in a way that was not aggressive, but was completely unambiguous about what it meant. She put the tablet down. "I'd like to call my attorney," she said. "That's absolutely your right," Tran said. "And you'll have that opportunity. But first, I need your badge and your access card. Both of them." Pause. Then Sandra Breck reached for her badge lanyard, with the kind of deliberate steadiness that Nora recognized as the performance of compliance rather than the thing itself a person going through the motions of. Cooperation, while running a separate calculation behind it. She unclipped the badge and held it out. Tran took it. "Access card as well," Tran said. Breck's hand moved to her jacket pocket, paused. The card, Tran said again. She produced it. A standard swipe card, but the plainclothes agent took it and handed it immediately to a second agent who had appeared from somewhere further down the corridor and who bagged it with gloves already on, which told Nora that the evidence protocol had been planned before anyone was in this hallway tonight. Breck was walked to the elevator with a quiet efficiency that looked, from any distance, like nothing more than a conversation between colleagues moving to a more private location. Nora stood at the SICU nursing station and watched her go. She did not feel the particular release she had expected. What she felt was closer to the end of a long physical effort, the moment when you put something heavy down and the muscles don't immediately register that it's over, just that the weight isn't in your hands anymore. She turned and walked to Bay 4. Adrian Calloway was awake. Not dramatically, not fully. She was at the early stage of extubation recovery. Voice rough. Awareness intermittent. The kind of conscious that was mostly biology reasserting itself rather than the person inside fully returning. But her eyes were open and tracking, and when Nora appeared in the doorway, she looked at her for a long moment with the specific, unclouded attention that sometimes accompanied a brain that had been through significant trauma and was still sorting out what was real. The Malinois lifted his head, saw Nora, put his head back down. Adrian said something. Too quiet, too rough, to be fully intelligible. Nora moved closer. You don't need to talk. You can rest. Dog, Adrian said. Slightly louder. He stayed. The whole time, Nora said. A very small movement at the corner of Adrian's mouth that might have been the beginning of something. Her eyes closed, then opened again with the effortful quality of someone fighting the gravitational pull of sedation. My dad, he's here. He's in the waiting room. He'll be in to see you as soon as the medical team clears it. Nora pulled the chair beside the bed and sat, not because she had been asked to, but because the alternative was standing in the doorway of a room where someone was trying to find their footing in consciousness, and that felt like the wrong geometry. You're okay. The surgery went well. You're going to need time, but you're okay. Adrian was quiet for a moment. There was something wrong with the IV, she said. I don't know how I know that. You don't need to know that right now, Nora said. That's handled. Who are you? Nora Vasquez. I'm a trauma nurse. I was in the bay when you came in. Adrian's eyes moved to the Malinois, then back to Nora. He likes you, she said. The voice was still rough, still effortful, but there was something behind it that was more alert than the sedation should have allowed. I got lucky, Nora said. Adrian almost smiled. He doesn't do that with people he doesn't know. A beat. Who are you, really? Nora looked at her for a moment. Someone who was here when you needed someone to be. Adrian held her gaze with the stubborn, slightly unfocused clarity of a young woman who was going to get a real answer eventually, and both of them knew it, but who also did not currently have the energy reserves to press the point. Okay, she said, and closed her eyes. Norris sat with her for 4 minutes. Then she got up, touched the Malinois once on the top of his head. He allowed it without moving, and walked back out into the corridor. The next 6 hours were institutional rather than dramatic, which was how the aftermath of things usually went in Nora's experience. Tran's team processed Breck through the federal booking procedure. The plainclothes agents completed their sweep of the SICU nursing station and the medication room, bagging and documenting with the systematic thoroughness of people who understood that the quality of the evidence collected tonight would determine what happened in a courtroom months from now. The hospital administrator, a man named Gregor Falk, who Nora had met once and found to be professionally competent and personally exhausting, was notified and arrived at the hospital at 9:15, looking like someone who had been pulled from a dinner party and was trying to project calm authority over the fact that 2 members of his clinical staff had been arrested in connection with a federal criminal investigation. She gave a formal statement to Tran's secondary agent, a younger woman named Reyes, who wrote everything down with the meticulous exactness of someone who had learned that the difference between a good case and a collapsed one often came down to the accuracy of intake documentation. Nora walked her through everything. The 9 weeks of notation, the access log cross-reference, the secondary MedLink trail, the medication line observation, the conversation in Briggs's office. She told it in order without editorializing, without performing the emotional content of it. Just the facts and the timeline, the way she had been taught to report in a context where embellishment was not only unnecessary, but potentially dangerous. Reyes looked up when she finished. You kept notes on all of this. From the third week, yes. On your personal phone. In a notebook. I photographed the relevant pages. And you didn't report any of it to administration. Patterns were anomalous, but not conclusive, until I had the MedLink comparison, Nora said. Reporting a suspicion without supporting evidence against a department chief would have produced one outcome. She paused. I'd have been dismissed. Reyes looked at her for a moment. Then she wrote something down. At 11:40, Calloway found Nora in the corridor outside the SICU. He looked like a man who had held himself together through an enormous act of will for 2 straight days and was now in the specific, fragile phase after the immediate crisis had passed, where the holding together required slightly more than he had left. He was not falling apart, he was too controlled for that, but the seams were visible in a way they hadn't been before. She's sleeping, he said. Adrian. That's exactly what she should be doing, Nora said. The doctors tell me full recovery is probable, he said. Probable with the weight of a man who had been in enough situations where probable and certain were separated by very significant distances. They're cautiously optimistic about the cardiac involvement. No permanent damage, they think. The compound cleared quickly, Nora said. It's in her favor. He nodded. It was quiet. They arrested the second one. The nurse. Yes, how long? He said. Not what was she doing. Not why didn't you know sooner. How long? The earliest access log entry under her credential is 14 weeks ago, Nora said. But given the institutional knowledge she was providing, probably longer before that. The log only captures system access. What she was providing verbally, or through other means, schedules, staffing rotations, personnel information that could go back much further. He absorbed that. And Vec, he said, in federal custody. His operation is being dismantled across 4 sites. Tran's team has documentation connecting him to at least 7 other incidents in 3 states. She paused. He's not getting out of this. Calloway looked at the floor for a moment. When he looked back up, his expression had settled into something that wasn't quite peace, but was in the same region. Contract he wanted. The Fort Crest Logistics Renewal. It was worth approximately $30 million over 3 years. That's what my daughter's life was worth to him. Nora didn't say anything to that, because there was nothing useful to say. I've been thinking, Calloway said, about what I would have done if you hadn't been on shift that day. If you hadn't known the command that settled the dog. If you hadn't looked at the ultrasound and understood what you were seeing fast enough to... He stopped. There's a version of this where I'm not having this conversation. There are a lot of versions of things, Nora said. The one that happened is the one where she's upstairs sleeping. Because of you. Because of a lot of people, she said. I was one. He looked at her with the expression of a man who was not going to argue that point tonight, but was also clearly not finished with it. Tran tells me she pulled the full Ridgway file. She mentioned that. I read the unredacted version this evening. A pause. My clearance was sufficient, apparently, given the current federal context. He was quiet for a moment. Pilot, who came back for us, the one who flew in without instruments. The debrief said she reported a chain of command breach. That targeting information had been compromised from inside the operational structure, and that the mission had been set up to fail. Nora said nothing. The debrief also shows that the report was suppressed, Calloway said, by a colonel who has since retired, and that the warrant officer who made the report was subsequently processed out of the 160th under conditions that were, to use the language of the file, mutually agreed upon. That's one way to describe it, Nora said. What's another? She thought about it. I was told my options. I chose the one that let me leave with my record intact. And in exchange, you stopped talking. In exchange, she said carefully, I didn't push a complaint that I was told would go nowhere against people who had significantly more institutional protection than I did, in an environment where making noise would have made my life very difficult without making anyone else's life any different. She looked at him directly. It wasn't courage. I want to be clear about that. I chose the path that hurt least at the time. You chose the path that kept you functional, he said. There's a difference. He paused. The colonel who suppressed that report is being contacted by federal investigators. Tran's case opens a channel into the operational breach you documented. It's 9 years late, but the record is going to be corrected. Nora had thought about that possibility in the car on the way back from Boulder, and she had not let herself think about it for very long because the emotional weight of was more than she currently had room to carry. She held it at a careful distance now. That's Tran's domain, she said. I'll cooperate with whatever they need. The 160th wants to know if you'd be willing to speak with their current JAG unit, Calloway said. Not about returning, just about the record. Tell them yes, she said. Not because she had worked out what she felt about it, but because the alternative, saying nothing, letting it stay buried, was a choice she had already made once and was not going to make again. Calloway nodded. Then he did something that surprised her. He extended his hand, formally, the way one officer extended a hand to another in acknowledgement of something that deserved the formality of the gesture. Nora looked at it for a moment, then shook it. Thank you, he said. Whatever comes after this, whatever you decide, about what happens next, thank you for tonight. And for the morning she came in, and for everything in between, she said. She's going to be okay, he said. I know. And the knowing of it visibly moved through him in the controlled private way that people processed enormous relief when they had spent a long time not allowing themselves to feel it. He went back to the waiting room. Nora stood in the corridor for a moment. Then she went to the nursing station to finish her documentation, because there was documentation to finish, and because finishing it was part of what needed to happen for the case to hold together, and because she had been a nurse for 4.5 years before she was anything else tonight, and the patient in Bay 4 deserved a complete, accurate record of her care. At 1:17 in the morning, Tran appeared at the trauma floor nursing station. She had the portfolio under her arm and the reading glasses on her forehead and the quality of someone who had been running for 36 hours and was now, in the specific aftermath of that, not crashed, but operating at the level that was all that remained after the adrenaline cleared. She sat down across from Nora at the charting station without preamble. Briggs is cooperating, she said. He started talking about 40 minutes after the lawyer arrived, which tells you how much the lawyer knew about what was in those devices. She opened the portfolio. He's given us the full communication chain between himself and Vec's network. 18 months of contact. He didn't know about Breck initially. She was handled separately, compartmentalized, which is standard Harland Group operational protocol. He found out she was involved approximately 6 weeks ago when Vec needed both of them to coordinate timing on a patient movement request. He didn't flag it, Nora said. No. By that point, he was too far in to flag anything. Tran's voice was flat, not judgmental, the tone of someone who had heard this particular story enough times to have stopped being surprised by the human capacity for incremental compromise. He's going to prison. The cooperation will affect the length, but not the fact of it. And Breck? Not cooperating at all. Tran glanced up, which is actually informative in its own way. It tells us she's been trained for this scenario. It's not a civilian employee who got in over her head. That's someone who was operational before she was ever at Hargrove. She set the portfolio on the desk. We're running her full background now. The 9-year history has some gaps that are going to be interesting when we fill them. Nora looked at the portfolio, at the pages of documentation inside it. At 9 weeks of a case that had started with a 23-year-old woman and a dog in a trauma bay and had expanded outward in all directions from that point. There's something I haven't told you, Tran said. Nora looked up. During the search of Briggs's device, we found a secondary file. Backup he had kept probably as insurance, the kind of thing people keep when they're not sure the people they're working with will protect them if the operation collapses. Tran's expression was careful. File contained information about you, your service record, the call sign, the Ridgeway mission. The real version, not the sanitized one. She paused. Harlan Group has known who you were since approximately week 4 of your employment at Hargrove. The ventilation system was too loud again. Nora noticed it the way she noticed it in the family consultation room on the first night, and the repetition of the detail felt like the story circling back to its own beginning. They knew, she said. They knew. And they didn't act on it because, per Briggs, Vec had a separate interest in your presence here. Specifically, Tran looked at her directly. Vec believed that a former 160th operator working inside a hospital that services Fort Crest personnel could be leveraged. In the same way, Briggs was leveraged. The weight of that settled in the room. He was going to approach me, Nora said, after the Calloway situation was resolved. One way or another, Tran said. Once Adrian was either dead or the colonel was neutralized enough that the contract pressure was removed, Vec was going to use the Ridgeway file as the opening move. Nora thought about that. About Vec's calculation, That a woman who had buried her military record to survive and spent 4.5 years building a quiet, disconnected life would be vulnerable to that particular lever. That the thing she had been protecting most carefully would be the thing that made her useful to him. He had not been entirely wrong about the vulnerability. He had been wrong about what it would produce. His mistake, Nora said, was assuming that a person hiding from their past is the same as a person afraid of their past. Tran looked at her. Yes, she said, it was. She closed the portfolio. I need to ask you something, Tran said. And I want you to answer honestly, without worrying about what the answer means for the investigation, because this case is in sufficient shape that your answer doesn't change it, okay? When you recognized the access pattern on Breck's credential tonight, before you showed me the phone, how certain were you? Nora thought about the moment, the photograph of the log, credential identifier, the staff directory cross-reference, the name. Certain enough that I wasn't waiting for a second confirmation, she said. But not 100%. There's rarely 100%, Nora said. There's certain enough to act, and not certain enough to act. I was in the first category. Tran nodded slowly. What you did tonight, the movement from Boulder back here, the positioning in the corridor, before we had a formal tactical plan, I should have pushed back on that. Officially, I should have told you to stay in the vehicle. I didn't, Tran said, because my read of the situation matched yours, and because you've been right every single time you've moved ahead of where I was. That's an uncomfortable thing to admit. She paused. But I'm admitting it. Nora thought about 9 weeks of being told she was overstepping. About Briggs in the trauma bay telling her that her job was to follow the clinical lead, not anticipate it. About the years before that, a different form of the same message, from different mouths. Thank you, she said. Because it mattered, and because Tran saying it had cost something, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Tran stood. We're going to need a formal deposition from you within the next week. Reyes will coordinate the scheduling. She picked up the portfolio. Get some sleep. Tomorrow is going to be complicated. More complicated than today? Different complicated, Tran said, and walked toward the elevator. Nora sat at the empty nursing station and finished her documentation and listened to the hospital breathe around her the ventilation, the soft overhead pages, the distant sounds of a place that never fully went quiet, that held its particular rhythm through the night, the same way it held it through the day, indifferent to everything that had happened within its walls, because the walls themselves were not the story. She was almost done with the last entry when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Not a Fort Crest area code. She stared at it, answered. Silence for 2 seconds. Then a man's voice, unhurried, low, with the specific, measured quality of someone who had spent a long time being careful about the weight of words. Warrant Officer Vasquez, the voice said. My name is Director Elliot Marsh. I'm calling from the Office of Defense Intelligence Oversight. A pause. I understand you've had quite a night. Nora said nothing. I'm calling, Marsh continued, because the Harlan Group case has intersected with an existing investigation that predates Agent Tran's work by approximately 3 years. And because the individual who suppressed your Ridgeway report 9 years ago was not acting independently. Another pause. I'd like to meet with you at your earliest convenience. There are things you need to know about why you were really assigned to Hargrove Medical Center. The nursing station was very quiet. What do you mean? Nora said, carefully assigned. Your Fort Crest placement, Marsh said. The travel nursing contract. The referral that brought you to Hargrove specifically. A beat. It wasn't random, Warrant Officer. It was never random. And the people who arranged it are not the people you think they are. She did not sleep that night. Not because she couldn't, she had learned, across years of shift work and operational deployments, and the specific kind of exhaustion that settled into the body like sediment, how to find sleep in windows of 40 minutes when 40 minutes was all there was. She didn't sleep because she sat at the nursing station after the call ended and let Marsh's words move through her the way you let cold water move through your hands, feeling the temperature of it, not trying to stop it. It was never random. She had believed for 4.5 years that Fort Crest was coincidence. The travel nursing agency had placed her here the way it placed people everywhere, matching credentials to open positions without any particular awareness of what those credentials meant or what history they carried. She had believed that because believing it was easier than the alternative, and because the alternative required her to consider that the quiet, ordinary life she had built might have been constructed around her rather than by her. She sat with that until 3 in the morning. Then she went to check on Adrian because there was always something useful to do, and because sitting with difficult information for too long without moving was something she had learned was bad for her specifically. Adrian was asleep. The ventilator had been removed. The extubation team had managed it successfully on the second attempt earlier that evening, and she was breathing on her own, which was both medically significant and, in the context of everything, quietly moving. The Malinois was in his position, head on his forepaws, and he looked up when Nora appeared and then put his head back down, with the settled quality of an animal that had decided nothing required its attention right now. Nora stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she went home, set an alarm for 6, and lay on her back in the dark and stared at the ceiling until the alarm went off. Director Elliot Marsh arrived at Hargrove Medical Center at 9:15 the following morning. Came with one aide and no visible security, which was either confidence or misdirection, and Nora had not yet determined which. He was in his early 60s, built like someone who had been athletic a long time ago, and had kept the structural efficiency of it, without the bulk, with gray hair cut short, and the kind of direct, assessing eye contact that typically belonged to people who had spent decades in rooms where everything said had secondary meaning. Tran was already there when Nora arrived at the small conference room on the administrative floor. She had been contacted by Marsh's office the previous evening, which told Nora that Marsh had made calls before making the call to her, which told her the sequence had been deliberate. "Warrant Officer Vasquez," Marsh said, standing when she entered. "I'm not a warrant officer anymore," she said. "No," he said. "But you were when this started, and I think it's more honest to acknowledge that." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Please," she sat. So did he. "I'll be direct," he said, "because I think you've had enough indirection to last a considerable time, and I'd rather not add to it." He folded his hands on the table. 14 months ago, my office opened an investigation into a pattern of military-adjacent infrastructure compromises. Supply chains, logistics contracts, personnel access. The Harlan Group operation was one arm of it, the most immediately dangerous arm, but one arm. The broader network has connections to defense procurement fraud that goes back 6 years and involves individuals at several levels of government contracting. "Colonel," Nora said, "the one who suppressed the Ridgway report." "Colonel Arden Polk," Marsh said, "retired, currently residing in Scottsdale. He will not be residing there much longer." A pause. "Polk was not acting on personal interest when he buried your report 9 years ago. He was protecting a procurement relationship, specifically a contractor who had provided targeting intelligence for 3 consecutive operations, including Ridgway, and whose continued access to operational planning depended on the breach not being formally documented." Nora looked at him. "The contractor, whose intelligence was what compromised the mission." "Yes. He buried my report to protect the person whose information nearly got 6 soldiers killed." "Yes." Marsh said it without softening it, which she appreciated. "And that contractor has been supplying compromised intelligence to military operations for 6 years, while collecting defense contracts worth approximately $400 million. The Harlan Group case is what finally gave us the legal thread to pull." He paused. "Specifically the financial connections between VEX operation and the procurement network. Briggs's device contained documentation that connected Harlan Group's funding structure to 3 shell companies that also appear in the contractor's financial records." The room was quiet for a moment. "You said my placement here wasn't random," Nora said. "Correct." Marsh looked at her steadily. 11 months ago, my office identified Hargrove Medical Center as a likely Harlan Group target. The institutional proximity to Fort Crest, the logistics contract value, the Callaway connection. We need someone inside the hospital who could recognize anomalous access patterns and who had the operational background to understand what they were looking at. He paused. "We identified you as a candidate because of your 160th record, your clinical training, and the specific skill set your service file indicated. Your travel nursing agency has a consulting relationship with a federal personnel placement program. Fort Crest position was made available to you through that channel." Nora absorbed this. "You used me," she said. Not with anger, she was past the available range for simple anger at this point, but with the precision of someone identifying what had actually happened. "We placed you in a position where your skills would be useful," Marsh said carefully, "without telling me what I was there for." "Without telling you," he acknowledged, "because a placed operative with full knowledge of the assignment behaves differently than a person doing their job. We needed you to behave like what you were, a competent nurse in a functioning hospital. If you had known, you would have been looking for things. Looking changes what you find and how you find it. Found it anyway, she said. Yes, Marsh said. You did. Faster and more thoroughly than my analysts anticipated. He paused. And in doing so, you saved Adrian Calloway's life twice and provided the evidentiary foundation for an arrest that my office has been working toward for over a year. He looked at her with the directness that had been consistent since he walked in. I am aware that the method was not fully ethical. I'm not asking you to agree that it was. I'm explaining it. Tran had been quiet through all of this. Now she said, the explanation is also an apology, even if he's not phrasing it that way. Marsh looked at her. It is, he said. Both. Nora sat with that. She thought about the 4.5 years she had spent in various hospitals in various cities, believing that she was choosing each position, each placement, each fresh start. Thought about whether any of those had been arranged. She thought about Flagstaff and Phoenix and Denton and what the federal personnel placement program's reach actually was. She decided not to ask that question today. There was a limit to how much architecture of deception a person could process before something structural gave way, and she was approaching it. What happens now? She said. Now Marsh said several things happened simultaneously. Colonel Polk will be formally charged within the week: procurement fraud, obstruction, and a third charge that my legal team is finalizing. Roland Vec has already been formally indicted on 6 federal counts, including conspiracy, attempted homicide, and defense contract fraud. Harlan Briggs has accepted a plea arrangement that will result in a 7 to 10 year sentence in exchange for his full cooperation. Sandra Breck has been charged independently and will face a separate trial. Her background investigation has revealed a prior operative history that adds national security dimensions to her case. And Adrian, Nora said, will make a full recovery, per this morning's medical update. He paused. And Colonel Calloway's contract renewal decision will proceed through normal channels, free of interference. And me, Nora said. Marsh opened a folder that his aide passed to him. He placed a single document on the table and slid it across to her. Your military record will be formally corrected. The separation circumstances will be reclassified. The Ridgeway mission debrief will be updated to reflect the original complaint you filed, its suppression, and its subsequent vindication. He paused. Everything you reported 9 years ago will be documented as accurate. Nora looked at the document. It was a formal request for record correction, already signed by Marsh and countersigned by someone above him, whose title she recognized as being several floors above the level she had ever operated at. This doesn't undo 9 years, she said. No, Marsh said. It doesn't. Nothing does that. What it does is make the record true. She looked at the signature line at the bottom, where her own signature was required. She thought about the 22-year-old version of herself, who had filed a complaint in good conscience and been told, in terms that were technically polite and substantively unmistakable, that the truth had limits based on who it was inconvenient for. She thought about what it had done to her understanding of institutions, of authority, of the systems she had trusted, and the people who ran them. She thought about how much of the past 4.5 years had been shaped in ways she was still only beginning to map by that original wound. She picked up the pen and signed it. The formal consequences arrived in the days that followed, and they arrived the way consequences usually did, not all at once, dramatically, but in increments that accumulated into something total. Vec's arraignment was covered by 2 regional news outlets and picked up nationally when the defense procurement fraud angle emerged. Coverage was careful, federal cases moved slowly, and good journalists understood the difference between an indictment and a conviction. But the essential architecture of Harlan Group's operation was reported accurately. Supply chain infiltration, hospital personnel compromise, targeting of a military officer's daughter. The story ran for 3 days on the national feeds before being displaced by something else. The way stories always were, but the 3 days were enough. People who needed to know knew. Briggs's plea arrangement was not covered publicly. The hospital administration was notified through proper channels. His privileges were formally revoked, and a brief, carefully worded announcement went to the Hargrove staff explaining that Dr. Harlan Briggs had resigned from his position effective immediately. It did not use the word arrested. It did not need to. The two federal agents who had been on the administrative floor were not invisible, and hospital staff were not incurious. And within 24 hours, everyone knew. Nora heard the conversations. She did not participate in them. She had her work. Sandra Breck's case was more complex, and its resolution would take longer. Her background investigation, as Marsh had indicated, revealed a prior history that recontextualized everything about her 9 years at Hargrove, not a civilian employee who had been recruited and corrupted, but someone who had been placed there with a cover identity substantially more sophisticated than anything Harlan Group alone would have constructed. The national security dimensions of her case moved it to a jurisdiction and a classification level that removed it from Tran's immediate purview. What happened after that would happen in rooms that Nora would not be in, and she was, on reflection, comfortable with that. Dr. Pamela Osei was cleared entirely. Her voluntary statement to Tran delivered, as Nora had suggested, promptly and honestly confirmed that she had no knowledge of Briggs's activities beyond the single corridor observation she reported. She was appointed interim department chief of trauma while a formal search was conducted. She came to Nora's nursing station on the third day and stood there for a moment with the expression of someone who had several things to say and was sorting out which to say first. "You knew before you told Tran," Osei said, "about Briggs." "I had strong reason to believe," Nora said. "Not confirmation." "How long?" "The same morning I reviewed the access logs. About an hour before I called Tran." Osei was quiet. "Could have told me." "I could have," Nora said. You were his resident. If I was wrong, it would have damaged your relationship with your attending in a department you were going to be working in. If I was right, the same problem existed from a different angle." She paused. "I made the call that protected your position regardless of outcome." Osei looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through her face that was more complicated than gratitude. It had the texture of a person reassessing a situation they had been seeing from one angle and suddenly being shown another. "Treated you like a subordinate," Osei said. "For 9 weeks. And you were doing all of this simultaneously." "I was doing my job," Nora said. "Both jobs." Still, Osei put a hand briefly on the edge of the nursing station. Not a gesture of affection, exactly. More of acknowledgement. Then she straightened. "For what it's worth, you're the best clinical observation I've ever worked next to. And I'm going to say this in writing to the department committee before the end of the week." She walked back toward the trauma bay. Nora watched her go and thought that it was a strange thing, being seen by people who had looked past you for a long time. Bad, just strange. Adrian Calloway was moved from the SIU to a step-down room on the second floor on the 4th day, and then to a standard care room on the 6th, which meant she was stable enough to be somewhere, without the specific vigilance of intensive monitoring. The Malinois made both transitions with her, and by the time she was in the standard care room, the nursing staff had stopped questioning his presence and started leaving water bowls near the door. Nora stopped in to see her on the 7th day. Adrian was sitting up, still bruised, still moving carefully around her repaired incisions, still with the specific fragility of someone whose body had been through something significant and was reclaiming itself in increments. She was alert, and she was impatient with the alertness, which was a good sign. "Keep showing up," Adrian said. "You keep being here," Nora said. "They're discharging me to the base medical facility tomorrow," Adrian said, "for the next phase of recovery." She looked at Nora with the direct, slightly searching quality that Nora had noticed the first night she was awake. "My dad told me some of it. About what happened." A pause. "About who you are." "Your dad doesn't know all of it," Nora said. "He knows enough." Adrian was quiet for a moment. "He told me about the Ridgeway mission, his version of it." She looked at the window. He said, "He spent a long time wanting to find the pilot who came back for them, and that when he found out who she was already in the same building." She looked back at Nora. "That's a strange thing to carry around." "A lot of things are strange things to carry around," Nora said. "You figure out how." Adrian looked at her for a moment with a seriousness that exceeded her 23 years, which made sense given what those 23 years had most recently included. "What are you going to do after this?" Nora had been thinking about that question for 7 days, in the margins of everything else. "Keep doing what I'm doing," she said. "I'm a good nurse. I was a good nurse before any of this happened, and I'll be one after. And the military record thing? The correction? That's being handled." She paused. "I'm not going back to the 160th. I'm not going back to anything I left. But getting the record corrected matters. Not for what it changes about the past, for what it says about the truth. Adrian nodded slowly. My dad said something like that. He said the record being true doesn't give you the years back. It just means the years that happened are actually yours. Nora thought about that. About 9 years of a record that described a woman who had stopped speaking rather than a woman who had spoken and been silenced. About the difference between those two stories and what each one did to the person inside them. He's right, she said. The Malinois stood, stretched in the particular, unhurried, way large dog stretched when they had been still for a long time, and then padded across the room and sat beside Nora. He looked up at her. She put her hand on the top of his head. He allowed it. What's his name? She said. She had not asked before. Ranger Adrian said. He's been my dad's for 4 years. He was supposed to stay at the installation when I drove into town. She paused. He didn't. No, Nora said. He didn't. She stayed for another 10 minutes. When she left, Ranger watched her go from the doorway with his ears up, tracking until she turned the corner. Colonel Calloway found her one last time in the hospital's ground floor corridor on the morning of Adrian's discharge. Not arranged, not scheduled, he was simply walking toward the exit, and she was walking toward the elevator, and they met in the middle of the way people met in institutions when the institution was where their lives had intersected. He looked rested in a way he had not looked since the day she met him. Still controlled, still carrying himself with the posture of someone who had been in command of things for a long time. But underneath it something had relaxed that had been very tightly wound. She's being discharged, he said. I heard. That's good news. It is. He stopped walking. She stopped. I spoke with Director Marsh this morning. The procurement case is going to trial in the spring. Polk will be charged simultaneously. He paused. He asked me to pass on that your formal record correction will be completed within the month. The specific language of the updated Ridgeway debrief was approved by the relevant oversight committee yesterday. Thank you for telling me. There's something else. He held her gaze. The 160th JAG unit wants to formally recognize the original complaint, not quietly publicly, as part of the record correction. They want to acknowledge what was done and what should have been done. A pause. That means your name and the specifics of the Ridgeway situation will be in a formal military record that is, while classified, accessible to a broader group of people with appropriate clearance. It is not the quiet correction I initially indicated. I know, Nora said. Tran told me. And I said yes. She looked at him directly. 9 years ago, I filed a report and was told the truth had limits. I'm not interested in limits anymore. Calloway nodded slowly. Something in his face settled into an expression she recognized now, after enough time studying it, not pride exactly. Because the pride of a colonel observing a soldier's conduct had a specific institutional quality that this didn't quite match. It was something more personal than that. The expression of a man who had been in the position of owing a debt for 9 years and was watching, belatedly, some portion of it being addressed. You didn't stop being a soldier, he said. I want you to know that. The uniform changed. The mission changed. But what you are the way you see things, the way you move through a situation that doesn't go away. I know, Nora said. And she meant it differently than she would have meant it 2 weeks ago. Not as an acknowledgement of what she had been, but as a recognition of what she still was and had always been, even in the years when she had been trying hardest not to be. Adrian wants to write you a letter, Calloway said. Formal one. She was very specific about the formal part. She doesn't have to do that. She knows she doesn't have to, he said. It's not really the point of a formal letter. Nora almost smiled. He extended his hand again, the same formal gesture as before, and she shook it. And this time the handshake held a beat longer, not because either of them was prolonging it, but because some acknowledgments required more than the minimum to feel complete. Then he walked toward the exit, and Nora watched him go, and she stood in the corridor of Hargrove Medical Center in Fort Crest, Colorado, and took a breath that went all the way down. The formal record correction arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered through secure channels to a contact address that Marsh's office had established for her. She read it twice at her kitchen table before her shift. The language was precise and institutional, and therefore, by the standards of official documents, unusually honest. The original complaint was documented. Its suppression was documented. The identity of the individual who had ordered that suppression was documented. And the findings of the Ridgeway debrief were corrected to reflect what Nora had reported, word for word, 9 years earlier. She sat with it for a while. There was no one moment when something lifted, which was not how she had imagined it, when she had occasionally allowed herself to imagine it. It was not a physical sensation of weight leaving. It was more like the subtle shift of a room coming into proper proportion when you have been standing in a space with a ceiling that's slightly too low for so long that you have adjusted your posture to accommodate it, and someone finally raises the ceiling, and you don't immediately stand taller, but eventually you do. She folded the document, put it in the same drawer where she kept her passport and her discharge paperwork and the small notebook she had been keeping since her 3rd week at Hargrove, and she got ready for her shift. Trial of Roland Vec and the Harlan Group principals began in March. Nora was not called as a witness in the Vec trial. Her evidence was documentary, and Tran's testimony covered the investigation's findings comprehensively. She was called in the separate administrative proceeding against Colonel Arden Polk, which took place in Washington, which meant she flew there on a Thursday morning and sat in a room that was smaller and less dramatic than she had imagined, and answered questions for 4 hours and then flew back. She was back on shift by Saturday. Briggs received his sentence in April, 8 years, the upper end of the plea arrangement, which the judge justified with language about the violation of institutional trust and the specific vulnerability of patients to harm from those entrusted with their care. The sentencing was covered briefly. Nora read the coverage once and did not revisit it. What she felt about Harlan Briggs by that point was neither triumph nor sympathy, but something more like the recognition of a cautionary map. Here is what it looks like when a person who was given authority uses it as cover for the part of themselves that is afraid, and here is what it costs, and here is the specific shape of the damage left behind. Sandra Breck's case was resolved through a classified process that produced no public record. Nora was told by Tran in a brief message that it had been concluded satisfactorily. She did not ask for more detail than that. Some rooms she did not need to enter. Vec was convicted on all 6 counts in May. The verdict took the jury 2 days, which in federal cases was fast. The sentence was 31 years. His network, dismantled across 4 states by the time of the verdict, was documented in the prosecution's closing argument as having touched 11 military families, 7 institutional targets, and 1 ongoing national security investigation. Closing argument named none of those families by name. It described the network's methodology in precise clinical terms that did not require dramatization to be devastating. Nora was not in the courtroom for the verdict. She was working. She heard about it from Tran, who sent a message at 3:40 in the afternoon that said only, "Verdict in. All counts. Thought you should hear it from me." She typed back, "Thank you," and meant it in the full dimension of what the words carried. The thing about rebuilding yourself is that you don't always know you're doing it until you look back and see the distance. Nora had spent 4.5 years making herself smaller, not weaker, not less capable, but contained, occupying the precise space that a civilian nurse occupied and nothing more. Not because she was ashamed of who she had been, but because the person she had been existed in a world that had shown her, clearly and specifically, truth filed in the right way with the right documentation could still be buried if the wrong people needed it buried. She had not known how to live as that person in a world that worked that way. What she understood now, sitting at a nursing station at the end of a long shift with the particular quiet of a Tuesday evening around her, was that the world still worked that way. The systems were still imperfect. The people in them were still imperfect. Truth still had to fight for its place in the record. None of that had changed. What had changed was what she did with that knowledge. The difference between running from a system that could fail you and standing inside it anyway, not naively, not with the optimism of someone who hadn't seen it fail, but with the deliberate choice to be the part of it that held, rather than the part that bent, was not a lesson she had arrived at cleanly. It had taken a dog in a trauma bay, and a 23-year-old woman with a compromised IV line, and a man who had spent 9 years wanting to say thank you to someone he'd never met, and an investigation that had been using her as an asset without her knowledge, and her own 9 weeks of meticulous, unglamorous, completely unacknowledged documentation. It had taken all of it. None of it was neat, but here she was, still working, still showing up 12 minutes early, still keeping the notebook. On a Wednesday in June, Dr. Pamela Osei, newly confirmed as Department Chief of Trauma, came to the nursing station and set a formal letter on the desk in front of Nora. Official offer. Osei said. The hospital is creating a new position, Clinical Operations Safety Coordinator, hospital-wide access, reporting directly to the CMO, with a mandate to review administrative and clinical systems for compliance and vulnerability. She paused. Gregory Falk suggested it. I seconded it. Trans office formally recommended you by name. She looked at Nora. It's a significant step up from the current role. Nora looked at the letter. I'm a good trauma nurse. You're one of the best I've seen, Osei said. You'll still be working trauma. This is in addition, not instead. What does the position actually look like day to day? Like what you've been doing for 9 weeks, Osei said, except now you're authorized to do it. Nora picked up the letter. Read it fully, all the way through, because she had been the kind of person who read the full document since before she could have articulated why. The position was real, the mandate was genuine, the reporting structure was appropriately positioned to give the role actual authority rather than nominal authority. It was exactly what it said it was. She thought about what it meant to be authorized, about the difference between doing the right thing in the margins, in the spaces where no one was watching and no one had given permission, and doing the right thing in a structure that acknowledged it as the right thing. Both mattered. She had done both. She would probably always do both, because the moments that mattered most tended to happen in the margins, in the windows between the official and the acknowledged. But having the official version too was not nothing. I'll need a week to think about it, she said. You have a week, Osei said. Then, for what it's worth, the answer you're already leaning toward is the right one. Nora looked at her. You don't know what answers I'm leaning toward. Vasquez, Osei said, with the dry, understated tone of a woman who had been watching Nora operate for 4 months. I've learned to read you slightly better than you think. She walked back toward the trauma bay. Nora sat with the letter for a moment. She thought about what Adrian had said in the hospital room. The years that happened are actually yours. She thought about the record correction in the drawer at home, next to her passport. She thought about Ranger, lying on the floor of Bay 4, with his head on his forepaws, watching the door. She thought about what it meant to be the person nobody noticed, and what it meant to stop running from the person you actually were. She was not the same person who had walked into Hargrove Medical Center 9 weeks ago with her badge clipped and her coffee unfinished, and her past buried under 4.5 years of calculated invisibility. She was not the same person who had left the 160th 9 years ago with a complaint filed and a choice made, and a specific necessary wound that had not yet finished teaching her what it knew. She was the person who had come out of both of those, carrying them, not as weight, but as information, equipment. She put the letter down, picked up the next chart. There was a patient in Bay 2 who needed a second look at a medication interaction that the resident had flagged correctly but not fully resolved. And there was a family in the waiting room who had been there for 3 hours and needed to hear from someone who knew what was happening in language they could understand. And there was a quiet corner of the administrative system that she had been meaning to cross-reference for the past week, because something in the scheduling data didn't quite line up. The work was in front of her. She went back to it. Not as the nurse nobody noticed. She was done with that version of herself, done with the strategic smallness of it, done with the idea that making herself invisible was the same thing as making herself safe. She went back to it as exactly who she was, a woman who had been dismissed and survived it, who had been silenced and refused to stay silent, who had been told her competence was an inconvenience and had kept being competent anyway, in the margins, in the official spaces, in the in-between hours of a night when everything was falling apart and someone needed to know what to do. The strongest people in any room were rarely the ones who announced themselves. They were the ones who were already working when everyone else was still figuring out the problem. Nora Vasquez picked up the chart, walked toward Bay 2, and got back to work.